History isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it's written in sand, waiting for the next wave of evidence to wash it away. Think about the stories you learned in school, the grand tales of empires and explorers, the heroes and villains that seemed as solid and unchanging as marble statues. We grow up with this idea that history is a fixed record, a collection of undeniable facts about the past. But what if that foundation isn't as stable as we believe? What happens when a single discovery, buried for centuries, challenges everything we thought we knew? This is the thrilling and sometimes unsettling reality of historical study, a field that is constantly alive, constantly breathing, and constantly rewriting itself. It's a journey into the unknown, where the past is not a dead thing but a puzzle with pieces still being found. This video is an expedition into that very idea, a countdown of 30 times historians were proven wrong in the most spectacular ways. We are about to witness the moments where long-held truths crumbled, where famous figures were seen in a new light, and where entire chapters of the human story had to be edited. This isn't about pointing fingers or highlighting failures. It's a celebration of curiosity and the relentless pursuit of truth. It's about the courage it takes to admit we were mistaken, and the excitement that follows when a mystery is finally solved. From ancient civilizations whose existence was once dismissed as myth to personal stories of iconic individuals that were completely misunderstood, we will see how the tapestry of our past is far more complex and fascinating than any textbook could ever contain. So prepare to have your perception of the past shaken. We are going to travel across time and continents, from dusty archaeological digs to forgotten archives, uncovering the evidence that forced the history books to be rewritten. This journey reminds us that our understanding is always a work in progress, and that the greatest historical mysteries are often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. It's a powerful lesson in humility and wonder, showing that the story of humanity is never truly finished. Let's begin this exploration of the 30 times a single discovery changed history forever. Our first example takes us back tens of thousands of years to confront one of history's most enduring caricatures, the Neanderthal. For more than a century after their discovery, these ancient relatives were depicted as the ultimate primitive brutes. They were shown in textbooks and popular culture as hunchbacked, grunting subhumans, roaming a frozen wilderness with little more intelligence than their crude stone clubs. This image served as a convenient contrast, a dull-witted foil that made our own Homo sapiens ancestors seem all the more brilliant and destined for success. It was a story that neatly explained why we survived and they supposedly vanished. But then, the evidence began to tell a very different story. Archaeological discoveries in caves across Europe and Asia started to reveal a picture of startling sophistication. We now know Neanderthals were not just simple hunters. They crafted an impressive variety of specialized tools, using a technique called levallois flaking that required foresight and intricate skill to produce razor-sharp spear points and scrapers. They were master survivors, adapting to harsh Ice Age climates, and there is compelling evidence they had a deep understanding of their environment, using natural glues made from birch bark to haft their tools, a process that involves controlled heating and precise application. Perhaps most profound are the clues pointing to a rich inner world, one that historians never thought to grant them. We have found sites where Neanderthals carefully buried their dead, sometimes even placing flowers or grave goods with the body. This isn't merely disposal, it suggests contemplation, ritual, and perhaps even a concept of an afterlife or a deep respect for their community members. The possibility that they created art is even more revolutionary. In Spanish caves, we find red ochre pigments and perforated shells that may have been used as jewelry dating back to a time when only Neanderthals lived in the region. There are even cave paintings, once attributed solely to modern humans, that are now being redated to periods overlapping with Neanderthal occupation. The final, undeniable proof of this paradigm shift is written in our own DNA. Genetic testing has revealed that most people of non-African descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal genes. This means our paths didn't just cross, they intertwined. We met, we coexisted, and we interbred. They weren't a separate, inferior species that we wiped out. They were absorbed into our own expanding populations. This completely rewrites the narrative of human history from one of simple replacement to one of complex interaction and assimilation. The story of the Neanderthal is no longer a tale of a dead-end branch on the human family tree, but a revelation of a lost cousin whose intelligence, culture, and very bloodline became a part of who we are today. Moving from our ancient relatives to the maps inside our own heads, we encounter a historical error so common it's become a cultural shorthand for ignorance itself. It's the idea that during the Middle Ages, everyone from peasants to kings believed the Earth was a flat disk, possibly held up by turtles or resting on giant pillars, and that courageous explorers like Columbus risked sailing off the edge of the world. This image is powerfully entrenched in cartoons, popular novels, and even casual conversation. But as a matter of historical fact, it is almost entirely a fabrication, a story invented centuries later. The truth is that the spherical shape of the Earth was not a controversial secret lost to the so-called Dark Ages. It was established knowledge among the learned for over 1,000 years before Columbus ever set sail. The concept of a round Earth dates back to the ancient Greeks. Philosophers and mathematicians like Pythagoras in the 6th century before the Common Era proposed it, and by the time of Aristotle in the 4th century, the evidence was considered overwhelming. Aristotle pointed to simple observations anyone could make: ships disappearing hull first over the horizon, the circular shadow of the Earth on the Moon during a lunar eclipse, and the fact that different constellations become visible as you travel north or south. A few centuries later, the astronomer Eratosthenes didn't just know the Earth was round. He calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy using the angles of shadows in 2 different Egyptian cities. This knowledge was preserved and passed down through the centuries by scholars in the Byzantine Empire and, crucially, within the Islamic world, where it was refined and expanded upon. So how did this flat Earth myth take such a strong hold in the modern imagination? The blame lies not in the Middle Ages but in the 19th century. During a period of intense conflict between new scientific ideas like evolution and religious literalists, some writers found it useful to paint the entire medieval period as an age of superstition and intellectual darkness. Washington Irving's largely fictionalized 1828 biography of Christopher Columbus played a particularly powerful role in popularizing the dramatic tale of Columbus arguing with flat earthers at the court of Salamanca. In reality, the debate Columbus had with the scholars of his day was not about the shape of the Earth, but about its size. He was using an incorrect, much smaller estimate of the Earth's circumference, and the experts were rightly skeptical that his proposed voyage to Asia was feasible. They knew the world was round, but they also knew it was much larger than Columbus claimed, which is why he unexpectedly stumbled upon the Americas, a continent entirely unknown to Europe. This case is a profound lesson in how history can be misunderstood and misused. The flat Earth myth tells us far more about the 19th century's desire to see itself as the pinnacle of enlightenment than it does about the actual intellectual life of the Middle Ages. It reflects a tendency to simplify and caricature the past, to create a simplistic narrative of progress where we, in the modern day, are the smart ones and everyone before us was foolish. This error reminds us that historical myths are often created to serve a purpose in the present, and dismantling them requires us to look past our own assumptions and actually listen to what people in the past themselves wrote and believed. The real story isn't about sailors fearing sea monsters at the edge of the world. It's about a continuous thread of knowledge, a conversation across millennia that was never truly broken. From our understanding of the ancient world to the pop culture images burned into our modern minds, historical misconceptions can be surprisingly stubborn. Perhaps no single image is more instantly recognizable, more powerfully evocative of a whole people than the Viking warrior, axe in one hand and a helmet with great curved horns upon his head. This figure dominates movie posters, sports team mascots, and countless illustrations, a symbol of untamed ferocity and pagan wildness. It seems so perfectly suited to the raiders and explorers of the Norse world that it's almost impossible to believe it's a complete and total historical fiction. The truth is, not a single piece of archaeological evidence, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the shores of North America, has ever yielded a genuine Viking Age helmet with horns. The iconic headwear is a fantasy, a costume designed centuries after the last longship sailed, and its creation story is a fascinating tale of art, nationalism, and theatrical flair. The real Vikings were, above all else, practical people. Their lives depended on efficiency and survival, whether on a trading voyage across the North Sea or in the brutal chaos of a shield wall. In a close-quarters battle, a helmet's primary job is to protect the skull from blows coming from all directions. A pair of large horns or wings would be not just decorative but dangerously impractical. They would create an easy handhold for an enemy to grab and wrestle the wearer to the ground, and they could deflect a sword strike directly onto the helmet in a way that could wrench the neck or knock the helmet clean off. The actual helmets we have from the Viking era, like the famous G-Germand Boo helmet found in Norway, are simple, functional pieces of iron. They are conical or rounded, often with a guard to protect the nose and sometimes a chainmail curtain to shield the neck. They were designed for maximum protection with minimal vulnerability, the opposite of the flamboyant horn design. Many warriors likely wore even simpler protection like stout leather caps or went into battle with no head protection at all. So where did the horns come from? The answer lies not in the 8th century but in the 19th. This was the era of Romanticism, a cultural movement that looked back to the medieval past with a sense of drama, emotion, and national pride. Scandinavian artists and writers, seeking to forge a distinct national identity separate from their European neighbors, latched onto the Vikings as heroic, noble ancestors. These romantic painters depicted them not as the complex traders, farmers, and raiders they were, but as mythic figures from a grand, misty past. It was in this atmosphere that the horned helmet was born, most famously through the costuming for an 1876 production of Richard Wagner's opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. Wagner's operas drew heavily on Norse mythology, and his costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created fantastical, imposing outfits for the characters. He added horns to the helmets to make the gods and heroes on stage appear more primal, more awe-inspiring, and more distinctly pagan to the audience. The image was an immediate sensation, a theatrical stroke of genius that was quickly copied by other artists and illustrators. This potent symbol then fused with a new wave of archaeological discovery. As real Viking artifacts began to be unearthed, the public was already primed by the romantic and operatic images. The horns stuck because they were a perfect visual shorthand, instantly communicating Viking in a way a simple conical helmet never could. The misconception was further cemented by a case of mistaken identity centuries older than the Vikings themselves. Several ancient bronze horned helmets, like the magnificent Vixo helmets from Denmark, actually date to the Nordic Bronze Age, nearly 2,000 years before the Viking era. When these were discovered, it was easy for a public hungry for a dramatic past to connect them to the most famous warriors of the North. The horned helmet is a powerful lesson in how history can be reshaped by art and popular culture. It shows us that our mental picture of the past is often a collage, pieced together from facts, fantasies, and a desire for a story that feels grander and simpler than the often messy reality. The real Vikings were formidable enough without the theatrical headwear, their legacy built on ships, swords, and sagas, not on a costume designer's brilliant but entirely fictional invention. And while our ideas about ancient warriors can be wildly off base, sometimes the greatest historical errors are not about misrepresenting a single culture, but about erasing the sheer scale of human achievement from the map itself. For generations, the story taught about the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus was one of emptiness. Textbooks often depicted the continents as a vast, sparsely populated wilderness, a pristine land waiting to be discovered and settled by Europeans. The indigenous peoples were frequently portrayed as small, nomadic bands living lightly on the land, leaving little permanent mark. This narrative, of course, served to justify colonization, suggesting that European settlers were building civilization in a near-vacant territory. But over the last several decades, a mountain of new evidence has completely overturned this view, revealing a hemisphere teeming with life, crisscrossed with trade routes, and dominated by enormous cities that rivaled anything in the contemporary Old World. The truth is, the Americas were not an empty stage. They were the setting for a vibrant, complex human story that was tragically and catastrophically interrupted. Consider Cahokia, located right in the heart of what is now the United States, across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis. Around the year 1050, at a time when London was a modest town of perhaps 10,000 people, Cahokia was a thriving metropolis, a center of religion, trade, and political power with a population that may have reached 20,000 or more. The city's skyline was dominated by enormous earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, is a colossal structure 100 feet high, with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was not a simple village. It was the capital of a sophisticated society that influenced a vast region. Archaeologists have found evidence of a grand plaza for public gatherings, a sophisticated wooden calendar known as a woodhenge used to track the seasons, and a bustling economy that traded in goods like seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, and exotic stones from the Rockies. Cahokia was the hub of a Mississippian culture that built similar mound centers across the Southeast and Midwest, a network of interconnected societies that historians are only beginning to understand. But the scale of human settlement went far beyond even these great cities. Across the Amazon rainforest, which was also long thought to be a largely untouched wilderness, researchers are finding evidence of incredibly advanced land management. Instead of simply living off the forest, indigenous peoples actively shaped it over thousands of years. They cultivated the soil to create incredibly fertile terra preta, or dark earth, which remains productive to this day. They domesticated plants and trees, creating vast orchards and gardens that supported large, settled populations. What European explorers perceived as untamed jungle was in fact a carefully managed landscape, a patchwork of villages, agricultural zones, and road systems that supported millions of people. In North America, too, the landscape was anything but empty. From the complex irrigation canals of the Hohokam in the Arizona desert to the longhouse settlements of the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, the continents were a tapestry of diverse and highly adapted civilizations. So what happened? How did such a populous and interconnected world vanish so completely from the historical record that it could be later described as empty? The answer is one of the most devastating demographic catastrophes in human history: the introduction of Old World diseases. When Europeans arrived, they brought with them a suite of pathogens: smallpox, measles, influenza, to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity. These diseases acted like a wildfire, spreading far in advance of the European explorers themselves. Epidemics raced along trade routes, reaching deep into the interior of the continents, often killing up to 90% of the population in a single outbreak. Societies collapsed. Cities like Cahokia were long abandoned by the time sustained European settlement began. and the intricate social and political structures that held these civilizations together dissolved. The survivors were often forced to adopt more mobile, decentralized ways of life to survive. When later European colonists finally pushed inland, they saw not the ruins of great cities, but the remnants of societies already shattered by disease. They interpreted this tragedy as proof of a land that had always been sparsely populated. This case is a sobering reminder that history is written by the survivors, and that our picture of the past can be profoundly distorted by catastrophic events that wiped away the evidence of what came before. The emptiness was not a starting condition, it was a tragic consequence. The image is seared into our collective imagination. The great library of Alexandria, a towering beacon of ancient knowledge, engulfed in a single catastrophic inferno. The flames, often blamed on Julius Caesar's troops or later, a zealous Christian mob licking at priceless scrolls containing the secrets of the ancient world. It's a story of tragic, instantaneous loss, a single night of fire that supposedly plunged humanity into 1,000 years of darkness, a convenient explanation for the gap between classical learning and the Renaissance. This dramatic tale is powerful, emotional, and almost certainly a gross oversimplification. The truth of the library's demise is far less cinematic, but in many ways more instructive. Historians now believe the library did not fall in one great conflagration but faded away over centuries, a victim of a slow death by 1,000 budget cuts, political neglect, and sporadic violence that gradually eroded the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever known. To understand its decline, we first need to appreciate what the Library of Alexandria actually was. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era under the Ptolemaic dynasty, it was more than just a repository for books. It was the world's first major research institution. Its mission was audacious: to collect a copy of every known book in the world. Royal agents were sent to markets across the Mediterranean to purchase scrolls. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's legendary harbor was searched, and any scrolls found were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes with the copies. Not always the originals returned to their owners. This aggressive acquisition policy filled the library's shelves with hundreds of thousands, perhaps even more, of papyrus rolls. It became a university for the greatest minds of the age, where scholars like Euclid formulated his geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference, and Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric solar system nearly 2 millennia before Copernicus. This vibrant intellectual hub was not housed in one single building, but was part of a larger complex called the Mauseon, or Temple of the Muses, a dedicated campus for scholars. The narrative of the single fire largely stems from one famous incident involving Julius Caesar. In 48 before the Common Era, during a civil war, Caesar was besieged in the harbor district of Alexandria. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from surrounding him, he ordered his men to set fire to the enemy ships in the harbor. Several ancient sources, including the Roman writer Seneca, report that this fire accidentally spread to the city and burned a large quantity of scrolls stored in warehouses near the docks. The key detail here is warehouses. Most scholars agree this fire likely did not destroy the main library building itself, which was part of the royal palace complex further inland. It probably consumed a secondary collection of scrolls, a significant loss to be sure, but not the annihilation of the entire institution. The library, as a center of learning, continued to operate for centuries after this event. So if Caesar's fire wasn't the killing blow, what was? The decline was a slow, grinding process. The first major factor was a shift in political patronage. The Ptolemies had poured vast resources into the library, seeing it as a source of prestige and soft power. When Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra, the new Roman emperors had their own capital, their own priorities. Funding for the library likely dwindled. Maintaining such a vast collection required an army of scribes, librarians, and conservators, all of whom needed salaries. Without the enthusiastic financial backing of a ruler who saw it as a personal project, the library would have begun a long, slow decay. Scholars might have left for better supported institutions elsewhere. This political neglect was compounded by the rise of rival centers of learning. The city of Pergamum in Asia Minor had built a formidable library of its own, and later, the great city of Rome itself became a magnet for scholars and books. As the Roman Empire grew, knowledge became decentralized. There was no longer one single place you had to go to access the world's learning. Furthermore, the physical format of knowledge was changing. The scroll was gradually being replaced by the codex, the bound book, which was more compact and durable. The Library of Alexandria was a monument to the age of the scroll. Adapting to a new technology would have been a massive and costly undertaking for an institution already struggling for support. Finally, there were almost certainly episodes of deliberate destruction, but they were scattered across different eras and carried out by different groups. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Emperor Aurelian recaptured Alexandria from a rebel queen and fought a brutal battle in the city's Prussian district where the main library was located. This conflict almost certainly caused severe damage to the library complex. Later, in the 4th century, as Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, the pagan temples and institutions of the Old World came under threat. The Serapeum, a magnificent temple that may have housed a daughter library or secondary collection, was destroyed by a Christian mob led by the Patriarch Theophilus around the year 391. These were significant blows, but they were part of a pattern of erosion, not a single event. The final end likely came with the Arab conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century. But even here, the popular story of Caliph Omar ordering the scrolls to be used as fuel for the city's bathhouses is considered a later legend by most historians, a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda invented centuries after the fact. By the time the Arab armies arrived, the great library of Alexandria was almost certainly a ghost of its former self, its halls mostly empty, its role as the center of world learning long since past. Its disappearance was a process of gradual abandonment, not a sudden execution. This more complex story teaches us a crucial lesson about the fragility of knowledge. It's not always a single, dramatic catastrophe that wipes out a civilization's memory. More often, it's the slow, insidious forces of budget cuts, shifting political winds, and simple neglect that do the most damage over time. The loss of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a sudden blackout. It was a long, slow dimming of the light. Now we turn from grand institutions to a specific, iconic monument and a story that perfectly illustrates how a compelling lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. Gazing out from the Giza Plateau, the Great Sphinx with its lion's body and human head is a symbol of ancient mystery, and one of its most famous mysteries is the missing nose. For generations, a dramatic tale has been told to tourists and repeated in popular culture, that the nose was deliberately shot off by Napoleon Bonaparte's artillerymen during his Egyptian campaign at the turn of the 19th century. It's a story that fits a certain narrative perfectly: the arrogant European conqueror wantonly destroying a monument of a timeless culture, a symbol of colonial vandalism. The only problem is that it is almost certainly not true. The damage was done not by French cannonballs, but by the sands of time and an entirely different kind of zealotry, centuries before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt. The evidence against the Napoleon story is both clear and comes from a time long before his invasion. The most definitive proof comes from the sketches and writings of European travelers who visited the Sphinx in the 15th century. A Danish naval captain and explorer named Frederick Louis Norden made extremely detailed drawings of the Sphinx during a visit in 1737, a full 60 years before Napoleon's campaign. Norden's meticulous illustrations show the Sphinx conspicuously lacking a nose. Even more telling are the accounts of the 15th century Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, who wrote in the early 1400s that the nose had been damaged. He attributes the vandalism not to a foreign army, but to a Sufi Muslim named Muhammad Saim al-Dar, who was outraged in the late 14th century by the local peasants' devotion to the Sphinx, which they believed could control the Nile's flood cycle. In an act of iconoclasm, al-Dar allegedly defaced the statue, and legend holds that he was subsequently hanged for the crime. While historians debate the specifics of al-Makrzi's account, it firmly places the damage in a much earlier era. So how did Napoleon get the blame? The answer lies in the powerful propaganda war that followed his expedition. While Napoleon's military campaign in Egypt was ultimately a failure, it was accompanied by a legion of scholars, artists, and scientists, the famous Institut d'Egypte. Their work, culminating in the monumental Description de l'Egypte, introduced ancient Egyptian civilization to Europe in breathtaking detail, sparking a wave of Egyptomania. Napoleon's enemies, particularly the British, were quick to seize on any opportunity to paint the French general as a barbaric despoiler of ancient wonders. The image of his troops using the Sphinx for target practice was a perfect, easily understood piece of political slander. It was a story that required no evidence, playing directly into fears and prejudices about foreign conquest. The tale was so sticky, so morally satisfying, that it persisted long after the political context that created it had faded from memory. This case is a brilliant example of what historians call an anachronism, the error of attributing an event or object to a time period in which it could not have existed. It also highlights how we often project our own contemporary conflicts and sensibilities onto the past. The story of Napoleon and the Sphinx's nose feels true to us because it resonates with modern concerns about cultural preservation and the legacy of colonialism. But real history is rarely so neat. The true story of the Sphinx's damaged face is likely one of slow erosion by wind and sand over millennia, punctuated by occasional acts of deliberate vandalism by individuals who saw the statue not as a treasure to be preserved, but as an idol to be destroyed. It's a more complex, less villain-driven narrative, but it connects the monument more authentically to the long and turbulent history of the land it has watched over for 4,500 years. The Sphinx's missing nose isn't a relic of 19th century warfare. It's a silent witness to centuries of changing beliefs, shifting sands, and the enduring human tendency to create a story that makes sense of the scars of time. But no historical label has been more misleading and more damaging to our understanding of a 1,000-year period than the term Dark Ages. It's a phrase that conjures images of a world plunged into ignorance and superstition after the fall of Rome, a long, bleak winter for the human spirit where learning was extinguished and society crumbled into chaos. This narrative of a dramatic collapse into darkness, followed a millennium later by a sudden renaissance, is a powerful and simple story. Yet, modern historians increasingly reject this label, arguing that the so-called Dark Ages, particularly the early Middle Ages in Europe, were not an era of stagnation but a period of profound transformation, reorganization, and in many places, significant innovation. To call it dark is to ignore the light that continued to burn, not only in the monasteries of Europe but in the magnificent cities of the Byzantine Empire and the thriving intellectual centers of the Islamic world. In Western Europe, the collapse of the centralized Roman administration was indeed a traumatic event. The structures that had supported large-scale trade, a money economy, and monumental building projects did weaken or disappear. But what emerged was not simply chaos. It was a reorganization of society onto a more local, self-sufficient scale. One of the most crucial advancements of this period was in agriculture. The heavy plow, possibly developed around the 6th century, revolutionized farming in the dense, wet soils of northern Europe. Unlike the lighter scratch plows used in the Mediterranean, this new technology could cut deep into the earth, turning the soil to create drainage ditches and making previously unfarmable land incredibly fertile. This innovation, coupled with the slow adoption of the three-field crop rotation system, dramatically increased food production. More food meant a more stable population and the surplus energy needed to build the foundations of a new society. This wasn't a step backward, it was a necessary adaptation that laid the groundwork for the later growth of medieval towns and cities. Furthermore, this era saw the development of new legal and political systems that would shape Europe for centuries. The complex, impersonal bureaucracy of Rome gave way to more personal forms of governance like the feudal system. While often simplified into a pyramid of lords and vassals, feudalism was a sophisticated network of reciprocal obligations that provided local security and justice in the absence of a strong central state. At the same time, the barbarian kingdoms that filled the power vacuum, such as those of the Franks and the Lombards, were not mere destroyers. They actively worked to create law codes, blending Roman legal principles with their own traditions. The most famous of these, the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, was a deliberate and state-sponsored effort to revive learning, standardize Latin, preserve classical manuscripts, and promote art and architecture. Charlemagne's court at Aachen became a magnet for scholars from across Europe, a clear beacon of light that shines directly in the heart of the supposed darkness. To focus only on Western Europe, however, is to miss the bigger, brighter picture entirely. While the Frankish kingdoms were finding their footing, the Byzantine Empire in the east continued the Roman tradition unabated. Its capital, Constantinople, was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe for most of the Middle Ages, a vibrant metropolis of libraries, universities, and magnificent churches like the Hagia Sophia, a feat of engineering that would not be matched in the West for hundreds of years. Byzantine scholars meticulously preserved the works of ancient Greek philosophers, scientists, and poets, acting as the essential custodians of classical knowledge. This was not a dark age, it was a golden age of Roman continuity where the flame of classical learning burned brightly. Perhaps the most significant intellectual light during this period radiated from the Islamic world. As the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates expanded, they established great cities of learning like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, scholars from various faiths and backgrounds were encouraged to translate all the world's knowledge into Arabic. They didn't just preserve the works of Greek thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy. They built upon them, making groundbreaking advances in mathematics, giving us algebra and the decimal system, and pushing the boundaries of medicine, astronomy, and chemistry. While much of Western Europe was geographically isolated and politically fragmented, the Islamic world created a vast, interconnected network of trade and scholarship that stretched from Spain to India. The wealth of knowledge that eventually fueled the European Renaissance did not magically reappear. It was largely reintroduced into Europe through contact with the Islamic world, particularly in places like Muslim-ruled Spain and Sicily. The term Dark Ages, then, is not just inaccurate for Europe, it is profoundly Eurocentric, completely ignoring the brilliant civilizations that were the true global centers of progress and learning during this time. The persistence of the Dark Ages myth reveals more about the historians who coined the term than the era itself. It originated with the Italian Renaissance thinkers of the 14th and 15th centuries, who, in their zeal to promote their own revival of classical ideals, deliberately portrayed the preceding 1,000 years as a barren wasteland separating them from the glory of Rome. This narrative was powerfully reinforced during the Enlightenment, when philosophers used the concept of a benighted, church-dominated Middle Ages as a foil to highlight their own age of reason. The label stuck because it served a rhetorical purpose. The reality is far more complex and far more interesting. The early Middle Ages were not a time of universal darkness but a period of dynamic change where old forms broke down and new ones were patiently built. It was an age of synthesis where Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions merged to create a new European identity, all while other great civilizations across the Mediterranean and beyond were experiencing their own golden ages. To let go of the Dark Ages is to see this period for what it was, not a blank page in history, but the vital, complicated, and often innovative prologue to the modern world. Perhaps no historical figure has been as thoroughly shaped by his enemies as King Richard III of England. For centuries, our primary image of him has been filtered through the brilliant but brutally effective propaganda of William Shakespeare's play. In that drama, Richard is an archetypal villain, a physically deformed hunchback who plots his way to the throne with chilling monologues, ordering the murders of his own young nephews, the princes in the tower, without a flicker of remorse. He is the ultimate usurper, a monster whose twisted body reflects a twisted soul. This powerful portrayal, written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a descendant of the dynasty that overthrew Richard, was not intended as impartial history. It was political theater designed to legitimize the Tudor rule by painting their predecessor as a fiend. For over 400 years, this Shakespearean caricature was, for many, the only Richard III they knew. Then, in 2012, a team of archaeologists did the seemingly impossible. They found him. The discovery of the king's lost skeleton under a city council car park in Leicester didn't just confirm a physical detail. It ignited a full-scale historical reinvestigation, forcing us to move beyond the Tudor spin and ask who Richard III really was. The excavation itself was a historical detective story worthy of its own film. Using old maps and meticulous research, the University of Leicester team identified the site of the medieval Greyfriars Church, where Richard was said to have been buried after his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. When they unearthed a skeleton with a clear curvature of the spine, and then confirmed its identity through mitochondrial DNA matching with living descendants, the world took notice. The physical evidence was undeniable. Richard III did have severe scoliosis. His right shoulder would have been higher than his left, and he would have had a visible unevenness in his posture. But the crucial detail, the one that immediately began to dismantle the Shakespearean myth, was that this was not a hunchback. A hunchback, or kyphosis, involves a forward rounding of the upper back. Scoliosis is a lateral or side-to-side curvature. The Tudors, in their propaganda, had exaggerated and misrepresented his condition, turning a physical challenge into a symbol of moral corruption. The skeleton also told a brutal story of his final moments. The skull showed multiple terrible wounds, including a slice that had sheared off a piece of bone, likely the killing blow. Other injuries on the body suggested he had fought ferociously, and some wounds on his back indicated possible post-mortem humiliation, a final insult from his conquerors. This was not the skeleton of a frail, cowering villain, but of a warrior king who died in combat. This tangible proof of Tudor exaggeration opened the floodgates for a modern reassessment of Richard's entire life and brief reign. Historians, no longer taking the Tudor chronicles at face value, began to examine his actions and policies on their own terms. What emerges is a far more complex and nuanced figure. While the fate of the princes in the tower remains the great unsolved mystery that will forever cloud his reputation, his 2-year reign as king reveals a ruler who was, in many ways, surprisingly progressive. He introduced legal reforms that were groundbreaking for their time. He established the concept of bail to prevent the imprisonment of individuals before they were found guilty of a crime. He also banned restrictions on the printing and selling of books, promoting the spread of knowledge, and he made the court system more accessible to poor people by allowing them to have legal counsel without having to pay fees. These were not the actions of a man solely consumed by greed and paranoia. They suggest a king concerned with justice and good governance. Furthermore, the portrait of Richard as universally hated is difficult to square with the historical record from his own lifetime. He was a capable administrator who had been loyal to his brother, King Edward IV, for years, effectively governing the north of England and earning the respect of its people. The North remained a stronghold of support for him even after he took the throne. The idea that he was a monster who had no supporters is a cornerstone of the Tudor narrative, but it collapses when you consider that many of the nobles who fought against him at Bosworth had previously supported him, only to switch sides for reasons of political expediency, not necessarily out of moral outrage. The real Richard III was likely a man of his time, ambitious, politically ruthless in a ruthless age, but also capable of loyalty, administrative skill, and a concern for the principles of law. He was a medieval king, not a Shakespearean pantomime villain. The discovery of his body did not solve the mystery of the princes, nor did it make him a saint. But it did something just as important. It gave us back a human being, a complex individual whose story had been stolen by the winners of a civil war and turned into a simple, powerful lie for political gain. It reminds us that history is not just about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story, and that sometimes, even 500 years later, the evidence can still rise from the ground to demand a more honest telling. Yet another powerful example of a legend crashing into reality, of myth being unearthed from the very soil, comes from the coast of modern-day Turkey and the most famous war story of all time, the Trojan War. For centuries, the tale of the beautiful Helen, the wooden horse, and the decade-long siege of Troy was considered just that, a magnificent story. A foundational epic poem by Homer, but a work of fiction, a grand allegory created by the Greeks to explain their own heroic past. The city of Troy itself was thought to be a poetic invention, a fictional setting for a fictional conflict. That is, until a wealthy, eccentric, and relentlessly determined German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann decided to prove everyone wrong. With a copy of Homer's Iliad in one hand and a shovel in the other, Schliemann's obsession would not only locate a lost city, but fundamentally challenge the boundary between ancient poetry and historical fact. Schliemann was a character straight out of an adventure novel, a self-made millionaire who retired early to pursue his childhood passion for Homer. He was ridiculed by the academic establishment of the 1870s. The experts believed Homer's work was pure myth, but Schliemann, an amateur in the truest sense, trusted the text as a literal guide. He went to what is now Hisarlik, Turkey, a site that matched Homer's geographical descriptions, and he began to dig with an almost violent fervor. His methods were, by modern standards, horrifying. In his frantic search for the Homeric city of King Priam, he ordered his workers to dig a massive trench straight through the center of the mound, carelessly destroying countless layers of archaeological evidence from later periods. But his brute force approach yielded a sensational result. He uncovered the remains of a fortified ancient city, and then a spectacular hoard of gold jewelry, cups, and weapons that he famously declared to be Priam's treasure. The public was electrified. Schliemann had done the impossible. He had pulled the city of Troy out of the realm of fantasy and into the light of history. Of course, the story is more complicated than Schliemann's triumphant narrative. Later, more careful archaeological work revealed that the mound at Hisarlik was not one city, but 9, built layer upon layer over thousands of years. The level Schliemann had identified as Homer's Troy, now known as Troy II, was actually far too old, dating to the early Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before the supposed time of the Trojan War. The treasure he found belonged to a king who lived long before any historical Achilles or Hector. Later excavators like Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Blegen identified a much later level, Troy 7a, as a more likely candidate. This city showed clear signs of a violent and sudden destruction by fire around the 12th century before the Common Era, a time frame that aligns much more closely with the traditional dating of the legendary war. They found evidence of a siege, including sling bullets and skeletons left unburied in the streets, pointing to a catastrophic end. This evidence forced a dramatic shift in historical thinking. It became clear that the Trojan War, as Homer described it, was not a verbatim historical account. there was probably no single 10-year siege over one woman, no giant wooden horse. But the epic poems were likely not pure invention either. They appear to be a powerful fusion of memory and myth. The discovery suggested that a real, major conflict did occur at this strategically vital city, which controlled the trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Such a conflict, a war for economic dominance, would have been catastrophic enough to reverberate through the centuries. The memory of this actual event, passed down orally through generations of bards, was then woven together with older myths, folktales, and the dramatic necessities of poetic performance over 500 years before being written down as the Iliad and Odyssey we know today. The story of Troy's discovery, therefore, is a case where historians were proven wrong in two ways. First, they were wrong to dismiss the entire legend as a fairy tale. Schliemann, for all his flaws, demonstrated that the epic was grounded in a real place and a real historical trauma. But second, the romantic, literal interpretation was also proven wrong. The reality was not a perfect mirror of the poem, but its foundational core, magnified and mythologized by time. This case teaches us that ancient stories often contain a kernel of historical truth, but untangling that truth from the layers of artistic embellishment is the real work of archaeology. It shows us that history and myth are not always opposites. Sometimes they are deeply intertwined, with one giving form and the other giving soul to the memory of a forgotten world. The walls Schliemann uncovered may not have been the very walls from which Helen was watched, but they were the walls that inspired the song, and in that they are just as powerful. For decades, one theory stood as the undisputed cornerstone of American archaeology, a simple and elegant narrative known as clovis-first. This model proposed that the first human beings to set foot in the Americas were big game hunters belonging to what we call the Clovis culture. Identified by their distinctive, beautifully fluted stone spear points, these people were thought to have crossed from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago. At that time, the last ice age had locked up vast quantities of ocean water in glaciers, lowering sea levels and exposing a land bridge known as Beringia that connected Asia and North America. According to the theory, these hunters then moved south, but they were blocked for a time by a seemingly impenetrable barrier, a continent-spanning ice sheet covering much of Canada. Then, as the world warmed, an ice-free corridor opened up between the melting glaciers, creating a pathway for the Clovis people to rapidly spread throughout the Americas, their signature spear points showing up in the archaeological record from coast to coast. It was a clean, logical story that explained the peopling of two entire continents in a single, swift migration wave. The only problem is that an overwhelming body of evidence now suggests this tidy timeline is fundamentally wrong. The challenge to this long-held dogma began quietly at a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde. In the 1970s and 80s, archaeologist Tom Dillehay led a team that unearthed something extraordinary: the remains of a small settlement with wooden foundations, animal hides, and stone tools that were clearly not Clovis. The material was exceptionally well preserved in the peat bog, and crucially, it was dated to around 14,500 years ago. This was a bombshell. Monte Verde was not only 1,500 years older than the oldest accepted Clovis site, but it was also located more than 10,000 miles south of the Bering Land Bridge. If the first Americans came through the ice-free corridor just 13,000 years ago, how could there be a village in the far southern tip of South America more than a millennium earlier? The implications were staggering. For years, the archaeological community was deeply skeptical, questioning the dating methods and the interpretation of the site. But as Dillehay and his team presented more and more evidence, including seeds, charcoal from hearths, and even human footprints, the reality became impossible to ignore. Monte Verde forced a painful but necessary paradigm shift. The Americas, it turned out, had to have been peopled much, much earlier. This revelation opened the floodgates. If Monte Verde was legitimate, then other sites that had been previously dismissed because they didn't fit the Clovis model deserved a second look, and they have been found all across the continent. At the Cooper's Ferry site in western Idaho, archaeologists uncovered stone tools and animal bones dated to around 16,000 years old, pushing the date of human presence back another 2,000 years. In central Texas, the Deborah L. Friedkin site has yielded a toolkit of small, blade-like artifacts from a layer of soil dating to 15,500 years ago, long before the Clovis technology appeared. Perhaps the most mind-bending discovery comes from White Sands National Park in New Mexico, where fossilized human footprints have been found pressed into the mud of an ancient lake bed. These footprints, which show people, including children, walking through the landscape, have been dated using seeds embedded in the same layers to an astonishing 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. This was a time when the great ice sheets were still at their maximum extent, meaning the hypothetical ice-free corridor through Canada would have been completely sealed shut. So how did they get here? The evidence from White Sands and other pre-Clovis sites points compellingly to a different route, the coast. Instead of waiting for an inland corridor to open, the first Americans may have been maritime people. They might have paddled skin boats or followed the coastline from Siberia, skirting the southern edge of the massive ice sheet that covered Alaska and Canada. This kelp highway hypothesis suggests they traveled along a rich coastal ecosystem, living off abundant marine resources like fish, seals, and seaweeds as they slowly made their way south. This coastal migration would have been possible even at the height of the glaciation, as the coast was ice-free. The journey would have been gradual, taking generations, as these pioneering communities expanded into a continent no human had ever seen. This theory elegantly explains how people could have reached sites like Monte Verde in Chile so early. They were simply following the coastline all the way down the Pacific side of the Americas. The collapse of the Clovis-first model is more than just an adjustment of dates. It's a complete rewrite of the human story in the New World. It transforms the narrative from a rapid, inland blitzkrieg of mammoth hunters to a much slower, more complex process of exploration and settlement that likely involved multiple waves of people using different routes over thousands of years. These first peoples were not just specialized big game hunters. They were adaptable foragers using a wide variety of tools and exploiting coastal, riverine, and inland environments. The Clovis culture, then, was not the first chapter of the American story, but a later, highly successful and widespread cultural phenomenon that emerged from populations already long established in the Americas. This case is a powerful testament to the self-correcting nature of science. It shows that even the most well-established theories must yield when confronted with solid, reproducible evidence. The story of the first Americans is now richer, deeper, and far more fascinating than the simple Clovis-first model could ever allow, reminding us that the human journey is always full of surprises waiting to be uncovered from the earth. From the vanished cities of the Americas, we travel to the heart of ancient Italy to unravel a mystery that puzzled historians for 2,500 years, the origins of the Etruscans. This sophisticated civilization, which flourished long before the rise of Rome, left behind breathtaking tomb paintings, advanced metalwork, and a unique language that still isn't fully understood. But where did they come from? The father of history himself, the Greek writer Herodotus, provided an answer in the 5th century before the Common Era that would dominate scholarly thought for millennia. He recounted a tale of famine in Lydia in western Anatolia that forced the people to split in two. One group stayed while the other, led by the king's son, Tyrrhenus, sailed away to settle in a new land which became known as Etruria. This story of an eastern migration was elegant and widely accepted. Yet, just like the legend of the Trojan War, this ancient account was eventually put to the test by modern science, with genetic evidence revealing a truth far more surprising about the roots of this foundational European culture. The Herodotus narrative was compelling because it seemed to explain the Etruscans' distinctiveness. Their language was non-Indo-European, standing apart from the Italic languages spoken by their neighbors. Their religious practices and artistic styles also had a unique flavor that some scholars argued pointed to influences from the Eastern Mediterranean. For centuries, this migration theory was the standard explanation, painting the Etruscans as advanced outsiders who brought their culture to the Italian peninsula. The alternative theory, championed by another ancient historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, was that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, but this view was largely overshadowed by the weight of Herodotus's reputation. The debate simmered for ages, a classic historical standoff between an ancient text and a competing hypothesis, with no clear way to find a resolution. That is, until the tools of genetics provided a way to ask the Etruscans themselves. Beginning in the early 2000s, scientists embarked on a remarkable project to extract and analyze DNA from ancient Etruscan burial sites. By studying the genetic material from skeletons dating back to the 7th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, they could compare it to genetic profiles from other ancient populations across Europe and the Near East. The results were decisive. The DNA from the Etruscan remains showed the strongest genetic links not to populations from Anatolia, but to other Neolithic peoples who had been living in Europe for thousands of years. Specifically, their genetic signature was most closely related to earlier inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. This was a massive blow to the migration theory. The evidence suggested that the Etruscan civilization did not arrive from across the sea in a single migration event, but developed locally, evolving from the indigenous Villanovan culture that had existed in the same region for centuries. But the genetic detective work didn't stop with the ancients. Researchers then turned to the modern populations living in Tuscany, the very heart of ancient Etruria. If Herodotus was right and a large group of Anatolians settled the area, you would expect to see a distinct genetic signature in modern Tuscans, setting them apart from other Italians. The studies revealed something much more nuanced. While modern Tuscans are, of course, predominantly Italian, their genetic makeup does show some unique, older strands. However, these unique markers were not a match for modern Turkish populations. Instead, they aligned perfectly with the genetic profile found in the ancient Etruscan remains. This created a powerful link across time, a genetic thread connecting the people of the region today with their Etruscan ancestors from nearly 3,000 years ago. The conclusion was inescapable. The core population of Etruria had demonstrated a remarkable genetic continuity from the Etruscan era right through to the present day. So how do we explain the unique language and culture that made the Etruscans seem so foreign to their neighbors, including the Romans? The genetic evidence doesn't mean the Etruscans were completely isolated. They were a major maritime power, trading extensively with the Greeks, Phoenicians, and other cultures across the Mediterranean. It is entirely likely that through this contact, they adopted and adapted foreign ideas, artistic styles, and perhaps even religious concepts, weaving them into their own indigenous traditions to create a unique and sophisticated civilization. Their language may indeed be a relic of a very ancient pre-Indo-European layer of Europe that survived in this particular pocket of Italy, rather than being an import from the East. The story of the Etruscans, therefore, is not one of mass migration, but one of local innovation fueled by international contact. They were not outsiders who came to Italy. They were the original Italians whose culture blossomed into one of the most influential forces on the early Roman state, leaving a legacy that shaped the Western world. This case is a perfect example of how genetics can act as a time machine, allowing us to test the stories passed down through the ages and sometimes confirming that the most fascinating histories are the ones written not in epic poems, but in the very DNA of the land and its people. The story of the Americas is a reminder of how much can be lost, but it also highlights the incredible resilience of knowledge, sometimes hidden in the most unexpected forms. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire managed one of the largest and most sophisticated empires in the world without what we would recognize as a traditional writing system. For centuries, historians believed they understood the Inca workaround, the quipu. These intricate arrays of knotted cords, often made of cotton or camelid wool, were classified as a simple mnemonic device, a complex but ultimately rudimentary accounting tool used by bureaucrats to keep track of taxes, livestock, and military supplies. It was a practical solution for a society on the move, but it seemingly confirmed a long-held bias that the civilizations of the Andes were advanced in engineering and organization, but lacked the intellectual depth that a true writing system provides. This perception, however, is now being completely overturned by a handful of dedicated researchers who believe the quipu is not just a primitive calculator, but a sophisticated, three-dimensional language, a lost writing system waiting to be read. The traditional view of the quipu as an accounting tool is not without merit. Spanish chroniclers from the 16th century observed Inca administrators using them to record numerical data with astonishing precision. The system is based on a decimal structure. The position of a knot on a string indicates its place value units, tens, hundreds, thousands. The type of knot, whether a figure 8 or a long knot with a specific number of turns, represents the digits from 1 to 9. A missing knot in a position signified 0, a mathematical concept the Inca understood conceptually long before it was formalized in the Old World. By reading these knots, a trained official, known as a quipucamayoc, could reportedly recite census data or inventory counts for an entire province from a single, portable bundle of cords. This was an undeniably brilliant system for managing a vast empire, but it confined the quipu to the realm of bookkeeping in the eyes of most scholars. What if the numbers were only the beginning? The groundbreaking shift in thinking came when researchers started to look beyond the knots themselves and consider the entire physicality of the quipu. Each quipu is a complex object. The cords have different colors, often made from dyes with specific cultural meanings. They are spun in different directions, Z-spun or S-spun, a detail that would be irrelevant for mere counting. The cords are plied together in various ways, and the main cord from which all the pendant cords hang can itself be arranged in a specific spatial configuration. Anthropologist Sabine Hyland has studied quipus from a remote Peruvian village, San Juan de Colata, where local community guards two quipus that their oral history claims are narrative epistles between village leaders during an 18th century rebellion. The villagers described the quipus not as accounts but as letters. Hyland's analysis suggests the colors, fiber types, and spin directions of the cords function like a syllabic script, where each combination of elements represents a syllable from a native Quechua or Aymara word. In this model, the quipu becomes a tactile, three-dimensional document, a textile tapestry of language where meaning is encoded in a way that is both seen and felt. The tragic obstacle to fully deciphering this system was a deliberate act of cultural destruction. During the Spanish conquest and colonization, the Catholic Church viewed the quipus as idolatrous objects, tools of the devil that perpetuated pagan beliefs. In a series of campaigns to extirpate indigenous religion, thousands of quipus were systematically sought out and burned. The Spanish authorities also recognized that the quipus were instruments of Inca power and knowledge. To control the population, they had to destroy their records and their history. This wholesale destruction means that only about 1,000 quipus are known to survive today, a tiny fraction of the vast archives that once existed. Even more devastating was the loss of the quipucamayocs, the trained readers. Many were killed and others were forbidden from practicing their knowledge under threat of punishment. The living key to unlocking the quipu code was effectively lost, severing the direct line of understanding. The potential of what was lost is staggering. If the quipu was indeed a full writing system, it means the Inca did not just have administrators. They had authors, historians, and poets. Their laws, their myths, their songs, and the biographies of their rulers could all have been recorded in these knotted cords. We think of writing as marks on a flat surface, but the Inca may have developed a profoundly different and equally valid form of recording complex information, one that integrated mathematics, art, and textiles into a single, unified medium. The ongoing work to decipher the quipu, combining archaeological finds with linguistics and the persistent oral histories of Andean communities, is one of the most exciting frontiers in historical research. It is a race against time to reclaim a lost chapter of human ingenuity, a chapter that promises to elevate our understanding of the Inca from a society that built Machu Picchu to a civilization that may have written its own epic story in a language of string and knots. And now we come to one of history's most successful branding campaigns, a story of image over reality that has echoed from ancient Greece right into our modern movie theaters and gym slogans. The image of Sparta is unmistakable. A society of ultimate warriors raised from birth for a life of discipline and self-sacrifice, where every man was a professional soldier and the state was a perfectly tuned war machine. We picture the 300 heroes at Thermopylae making their legendary stand against the vast Persian army, a symbol of courage against impossible odds. This vision of Spartan invincibility is so powerful that it has become synonymous with martial excellence. But when we pull back the curtain of myth and look at the full span of Spartan history, a far more complex and less flattering picture emerges. The truth is that Sparta's reputation for undefeatable military supremacy is a carefully crafted legend, one that often crumbles under the weight of its own significant battlefield defeats and deep-seated political weaknesses. The origin of the Spartan myth begins ironically with their greatest moment, the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 before the Common Era. While the stand of King Leonidas and his 300 Spartiates was indeed heroic, the popular story often forgets the 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who also fought and died alongside them. More importantly, Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, a delaying action meant to buy time for the main Greek fleet. The ultimate victory over the Persians was secured later that year by the Athenian-led navy at the Battle of Salamis, and then decisively concluded the following year by a massive, unified Greek army at Plataea, where Spartans fought bravely alongside soldiers from many other city-states. Yet, in the popular imagination, it is the Spartan sacrifice at Thermopylae that has come to define the entire Persian War, a testament to the power of a compelling narrative. Sparta itself actively cultivated this image. Their entire social system, the agoge, which trained boys for war, and their austere lifestyle, were designed to project an aura of fearsome professionalism. This was a form of strategic propaganda. If your enemies already believe you are invincible, they might surrender or avoid conflict altogether without you ever having to draw a sword. However, a closer examination of the historical record reveals that the Spartan war machine was far from unbeatable. Just a few decades after their glory in the Persian Wars, Sparta found itself locked in a 3-decade-long struggle for dominance with Athens, known as the Peloponnesian War. While Sparta ultimately emerged victorious in 404 before the Common Era, this was not achieved through superior hoplite warfare. The famed Spartan soldiers, unbeatable in a pitched battle on land, were completely outmatched by the Athenian navy and the city's formidable long walls, which made a direct assault impossible. Sparta's victory was secured only after they accepted massive financial aid from their former enemy, Persia, and used it to build a fleet that could finally challenge Athens at sea. The final blow was not a glorious hoplite charge, but a naval blockade that starved Athens into submission. This long, grinding war exposed Sparta's critical weakness. It was a one-trick pony, brilliant at one form of combat but strategically inflexible and financially impoverished. The myth of invincibility was shattered completely in the century that followed. The city-state of Thebes, long dismissed by Sparta as a lesser power, produced a brilliant military innovator named Epaminondas. In 371 before the Common Era, the Theban and Spartan armies met at the Battle of Leuctra. The Spartans, confident in their traditional tactics, were utterly devastated. Epaminondas introduced a revolutionary new tactic, massing his troops on his left wing to an unprecedented depth of 50 shields, and using this concentrated force to smash directly into the Spartan elite troops, killing their king and breaking the backbone of their army. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Sparta, one from which it never truly recovered. Just a few years later, Epaminondas led an army into the Spartan homeland of Laconia itself, something no enemy army had done in centuries. He not only ravaged the countryside, but most symbolically, he freed the Helots, the enslaved population that formed the entire economic foundation of the Spartan state, and helped them establish an independent city of Messene. This act permanently crippled Sparta's economy and its ability to field a large army. A society built on the brutal subjugation of a vast underclass had been fatally undermined. The romanticization of Sparta is largely a later invention, particularly from the 18th century Enlightenment and 19th century Romantic movements. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau admired what they saw as a virtuous, egalitarian society of citizen soldiers, conveniently ignoring the fact that this equality was only for a small minority of male citizens and was built on the backs of a brutally oppressed Helot population. This idealized vision was then adopted by various political and military regimes in the modern era, who found the image of a disciplined, militaristic state useful for their own purposes. This romantic filter has unfairly overshadowed the achievements of other Greek city-states, particularly Athens, which was not only a military power but a vibrant democracy and the epicenter of philosophical, artistic, and scientific innovation that would fundamentally shape Western civilization. Thebes, too, under Epaminondas, demonstrated that military genius was not a Spartan monopoly. The real story of ancient Greece is not the tale of one perfect warrior society, but a dynamic and often chaotic competition among many different city-states, each with its own unique strengths and flaws. The Spartan myth endures not because it is entirely true, but because it offers a simple, powerful story of discipline and sacrifice. The historical reality, however, is a crucial lesson in the dangers of believing your own propaganda and the inevitable vulnerability that comes from a society resistant to change and built upon systemic injustice. But few names in history have been as successfully and permanently blackened as that of the Vandals. The word itself has entered our language as a synonym for wanton, senseless destruction. To call someone a Vandal is to accuse them of a particular kind of ignorance-driven ruin, of breaking things for the sheer sake of it. This image of the rampaging barbarian horde sweeping out of the north to bring down the glories of Rome is a powerful one. Yet, as with so many of our historical caricatures, the truth is far more complex and far less dramatic. The Vandals were not simply agents of chaos. They were a people caught in the great upheaval of the migration period, and their most infamous act, the sack of Rome in the year 455, has been magnified through the lens of Roman propaganda to obscure the reality of a sophisticated and surprisingly durable kingdom they built in the heart of the Mediterranean. The primary reason for the Vandals' terrible reputation is simple. History is written by the losers, but it is often edited by the winners who come after. The Vandals were Arian Christians, following a branch of Christianity that the Catholic Church in Rome had declared a heresy. Nearly all the surviving historical accounts of the Vandals were written by Catholic Romans, men who saw the Vandals not just as political enemies but as religious ones. Writers like Procopius and Victor of Vita had every incentive to paint the Vandal kings as sacrilegious tyrants, exaggerating their actions to serve a theological and political narrative. When the Eastern Roman Empire, under the devoutly Catholic Emperor Justinian, launched a reconquest of North Africa in the 6th century, this negative portrayal became the official story, justifying a war of aggression as a holy crusade to liberate the faithful from heretical oppressors. The label of Vandal was a powerful piece of propaganda that has stuck for 1500 years. The event that cemented their name in infamy was, of course, the sack of Rome. In the year 455, the Vandal king Genseric sailed his fleet from his North African capital at Carthage to Italy. The Western Roman Emperor, Petronius Maximus, had been murdered just days before, leaving a power vacuum. Genseric claimed he was coming at the invitation of the Empress Licinia Eudoxia, the widow of a previous emperor, to secure her interests. The city of Rome, no longer the imperial capital and militarily weak, opened its gates to him. The subsequent looting lasted for 14 days. The Vandals systematically stripped the city of its movable wealth, including the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and even the menorah from the temple in Jerusalem, which had been brought to Rome as a trophy centuries earlier. This was undoubtedly a massive and humiliating blow to Roman prestige, but was it an orgy of vandalism as we understand the term? The historical accounts, while emphasizing the taking of treasure, notably do not describe widespread slaughter of civilians, the burning of the city, or the deliberate destruction of major buildings. It was a calculated, strategic plunder by a state that understood the symbolic and financial value of Rome's riches, not a frenzied demolition. Compared to the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, or even the brutal suppression of internal revolts by Roman armies themselves, the Vandal takeover was relatively disciplined. To truly understand the Vandals, we must look not at their most famous raid, but at the kingdom they built. After crossing the Rhine into the Roman Empire in 406, the Vandals traveled through Gaul and into Spain before being pushed south. Under the brilliant leadership of Genseric, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa in 429. This was no mere band of raiders, it was a migration of an entire people, including women, children, and warriors. Within a decade, Genseric had defeated Roman armies, captured the magnificent city of Carthage, the second city of the Western Empire, and established a powerful and independent Vandal kingdom. This was their real achievement, and it reveals a people with significant political and administrative skill. The Vandal Kingdom of North Africa lasted for almost a century, a period of stability and even prosperity in a region that had been neglected by the distant Roman government in Italy. The Vandals did not simply destroy the existing Roman system, they took it over and made it work for them. They continued to use Roman administrators, Roman law, and the complex Roman tax system to govern their new territory. The grain shipments from North Africa, which had been the lifeblood of the city of Rome for centuries, were now redirected to feed the Vandal court and army or sold for profit. Carthage remained a thriving commercial hub, and the Vandals became a major naval power, controlling the western Mediterranean and launching raids as far away as Greece. Their kingdom was not a cultural wasteland. There is evidence of vibrant intellectual life, with poets and scholars working under Vandal patronage. While they did confiscate some Catholic Church property for their own Arian clergy, the idea of relentless, brutal persecution is again largely a product of hostile sources. For the majority of the population, Roman Africans, merchants, farmers' life under the Vandals likely continued much as it had before, just with a new set of rulers collecting the taxes. The story of the Vandals, therefore, is a classic case of the victor writing the history to justify their own actions. The Eastern Roman conquest of their kingdom in the 530s was portrayed as a glorious liberation, and to make that story work, the Vandals had to be cast as monstrous oppressors. Their name became a byword for destruction because it served a political purpose. The reality is that they were a formidable and adaptable people who successfully carved out a place for themselves from the crumbling Roman Empire, establishing a state that lasted longer than many modern nations have existed. They were certainly not peaceful. No successful power in the ancient world was, but they were far more than the mindless wreckers of legend. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the labels we attach to historical groups often tell us more about the biases of the people who created those labels than they do about the people themselves. While the Vandals were unfairly cast as destroyers by their enemies, our next case involves a deliberate and cunning act of creation, a forgery designed not to tear down history but to invent it. In the early 20th century, the scientific world was gripped by a fierce debate over human origins. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was widely accepted, but the fossil evidence for the so-called missing link between apes and humans was sparse and confusing. Different parts of the world were yielding different clues. Then, in a gravel pit in Piltdown, a small village in southern England, an amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson made an earth-shattering discovery. He unearthed fragments of a skull that seemed to be the perfect answer. It had a large human-like brain case but an ape-like jaw. Dubbed Piltdown-Man, it was immediately celebrated as the earliest Englishman, scientific proof that humanity's big brain had evolved first, right there on British soil. It was a discovery that would captivate the world and misdirect the science of human evolution for more than 4 decades. The timing and location of the find were crucial to its acceptance. For many in the British scientific establishment, Piltdown-Man was a source of immense national pride. At a time when other European powers were uncovering ancient ancestors like Neanderthals in Germany and Cro-Magnons in France, here was evidence that Britain held a pivotal, even superior, place in the human story. The fossil appeared to show that intelligence, as represented by a large cranium, was the primary driving force of human evolution, a notion that appealed to the biases of the era. A prestigious team of experts, including Arthur Smith Woodward of the Natural History Museum and the renowned paleontologist and Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, authenticated the find. They presented it to the Geological Society of London in 1912 to great acclaim. Piltdown-Man, scientifically named Eoanthropus dawsoni, or Dawson's Dawn Man, was quickly integrated into textbooks and museum displays as a key piece of the human evolutionary puzzle. But from the very beginning, there were whispers of doubt, as more genuine hominid fossils were discovered in Africa and Asia, like the small-brained but bipedal Australopithecus found by Raymond Dart in 1924. Piltdown-Man began to look like an increasingly awkward outlier. These other fossils suggested that walking upright evolved long before a large brain, the complete opposite of what Piltdown implied. It simply did not fit into the growing family tree. Yet, because it had been endorsed by such eminent figures, and because it fit a powerful nationalistic narrative, it was given a privileged place. Critics who pointed out the strange wear on the teeth or the fact that the skull and jaw never seemed to fit together quite right were often dismissed. The fossil was treated as a puzzling anomaly rather than a probable fake, its contradictions explained away as evidence of a unique evolutionary path. The truth finally began to emerge in the late 1940s with the development of new, more rigorous scientific dating methods. When a young scientist named Kenneth Oakley applied a fluorine absorption test to the Piltdown bones, the results were shocking. This test measures how long bones have been buried by assessing the amount of fluorine they have absorbed from groundwater. The Piltdown cranium and jawbone contained drastically different amounts of fluorine, proving they were not the same age. The cranium was relatively young, perhaps only a few tens of thousands of years old, while the jaw was even younger. Further examination under a microscope revealed that the primitive wear on the orangutan teeth had been artificially created with an abrasive file. The final, humiliating proof came with the discovery that the bones had been chemically stained with potassium dichromate to match the color of the gravel and appear ancient. The Piltdown-Man was a complete fabrication, a human medieval skull cunningly paired with the jaw of an orangutan, with the teeth carefully filed down to look human. The exposure of the hoax in 1953 was a tremendous scandal that rocked the scientific community. It had been a brilliantly constructed fraud, playing perfectly on the preconceptions and desires of the experts of the day. The question of who was responsible remains a topic of lively debate. Charles Dawson, the discoverer, is the prime suspect, a man hungry for the prestige and recognition that eluded him as an amateur. But he could not have acted alone. The sophistication of the forgery suggests inside knowledge. Was Arthur Smith Woodward, the museum expert, a gullible victim or an accomplice? What about Teilhard de Chardin, or even the famous author Arthur Conan Doyle, who lived nearby and had an interest in paleontology? The list of potential conspirators is long, and the mystery may never be fully solved. The legacy of Piltdown is a profound lesson in the fallibility of science and the power of confirmation bias. Scientists are human, and they can be just as susceptible to wanting to believe a story that flatters their national pride or confirms their theoretical expectations. The hoax persisted for so long not because scientists were stupid, but because they were looking for evidence to support a pre-existing idea. It slowed down the acceptance of genuine discoveries from Africa, forcing researchers to waste years trying to fit the square peg of Piltdown into the round hole of an emerging fossil record that pointed squarely to an African origin for humanity. The eventual unmasking of the forgery, however, is also a testament to the self-correcting nature of the scientific method. As new technologies emerged and the weight of contradictory evidence grew too heavy to ignore, the truth prevailed. Piltdown-Man stands as a permanent warning, a reminder that in the pursuit of knowledge, we must be most critical of the discoveries we most want to be true. When we picture the downfall of the Maya, it often comes with a singular, dramatic image. Magnificent stone cities like Tikal and Palenque, swallowed by the jungle as their populations vanish into thin air. It's a story of a great and mysterious collapse, a riddle wrapped in vines, where a brilliant civilization simply ceased to be around the year 900 of the Common Era. This narrative of a sudden, total disappearance is powerfully evocative, but it's also a profound historical oversimplification. The truth is far more interesting and speaks to the resilience of a people, not their extinction. What actually occurred was not a single catastrophic event that wiped the Maya from the map, but a major political and demographic transformation, a collapse of the classic system in the southern lowlands, even as Maya culture adapted, moved, and continued to thrive with remarkable vitality in the northern Yucatan Peninsula for several more centuries. To understand this shift, we need to look at what really defined the classic Maya peak. The famous jungle cities of the south, like Tikal, Capon, and Calakmul, were the epicenters of a particular kind of power structure. They were ruled by divine kings known as Kayuhul-Adjor, or holy lords. These kings derived their authority from a complex relationship with the gods and their ancestors, and they demonstrated this power through massive building projects, towering pyramid temples, grand plazas, and intricate palaces. Their legitimacy was recorded on beautifully carved stone stelae, which chronicled their dynasties, their military victories, and their sacred rituals. The entire society in the southern lowlands was heavily dependent on intensive agriculture, particularly sophisticated systems of terracing and irrigation, to support a very high population density. This system was incredibly successful for centuries, but it was also fragile, built on a delicate balance of political allegiance, religious belief, and environmental stability. Then, between the 8th and 9th centuries, this balance was shattered in the south. The carving of royal monuments ceased, grand palaces were abandoned. The intricate trade networks that connected these city-states fell silent. It was a real collapse, but not a mysterious one. Historians and archaeologists now point to a perfect storm of interconnected factors. Prolonged and severe droughts revealed by analysis of lakebed sediments and cave stalagmites, placed incredible stress on the water-dependent agricultural system. This environmental pressure likely led to food shortages, famine, and social unrest. At the same time, there is evidence of intense warfare, not just between kingdoms but within them. The stone carvings from this period show an increase in references to conflict, the taking of royal hostages, and the overthrow of dynasties. It seems the people's faith in the cahokia-civilization to intercede with the gods and ensure reign and prosperity was irreparably broken. The social contract collapsed. People didn't vanish. They likely voted with their feet, abandoning the great capital cities and dispersing into the countryside or migrating towards more reliable sources of water and stability. This is where the story splits in two and where the old narrative of a total collapse fails. While the southern cities were being reclaimed by the forest, a new chapter of Maya history was already being written in the north. The Yucatan Peninsula, with its different geography, became the new heartland. This region had always been part of the Maya world, but it now surged to the forefront. Cities like Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan rose to prominence, forming powerful political leagues and confederacies. The key to their success was adaptation. The northern Yucatan has little surface water. Its lifeblood is a vast system of natural sinkholes called cenotes. The Maya in the north adapted their architecture and society around these vital water sources. Their political model also evolved. While still hierarchical, power in centers like Chichen Itza appears to have been less concentrated in a single divine king and more shared among a council of elites, a structure perhaps better suited to navigating the challenges of the time. The cultural continuity is undeniable and spectacular. The Maya in the north did not forget who they were. They continued to use the sophisticated Maya calendar. They kept writing in their hieroglyphic script, though often on perishable bark paper books called codices rather than solely on stone monuments, and they maintained their advanced knowledge of astronomy. Chichen Itza's famous El Castillo Pyramid is a massive stone calendar designed with 4 stairways of 91 steps each, adding up to 365 and casting a shadow in the shape of a serpent during the equinoxes. This is not the work of a people in decline. It is the work of a civilization that has transformed and persevered. Trade flourished, connecting the Yucatan to other cultures across Mesoamerica. In fact, when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered thriving, populous Maya kingdoms that resisted conquest for much longer than the Aztecs did. The last independent Maya city, Nochpatane, did not fall to Spanish forces until 1697, nearly 800 years after the so-called collapse of the Classic period. The real error in the traditional story is one of perspective. From the viewpoint of an archaeologist standing in the silent courtyard of Tikal in the year 1200, it certainly looks like a collapse. But from the bustling plazas of Chichen Itza at the same time, it was a golden age. The idea of a total disappearance says more about our own fascination with dramatic ruins and mysterious declines than it does about the actual historical experience of the Maya people. Their story is not one of an ending, but of remarkable resilience and reinvention. It teaches us that civilizations are not monolithic entities that simply rise and fall. They are dynamic, they adapt to changing circumstances, and their cultural heart can continue beating strongly even when their political centers of gravity shift. The Maya never went away. They simply turned the page and began a new, vibrant chapter, one that continues to be written by their millions of descendants living in the region today. While the story of the Maya shows us how a civilization can transform rather than disappear, our next case reveals how a simple historical label can create a picture that is profoundly misleading. We often learn about Japan's Edo period from the early 17th to the mid-19th century under the powerful term sakoku, which literally translates to closed country. This word conjures an image of Japan as a hermetically sealed island kingdom. a silent, isolated society cut off from the rest of the world, frozen in time like a fly in amber while the West underwent revolutions and industrialization. It's a compelling narrative of deliberate isolation, but it's one that modern historians have completely dismantled. The truth is that Japan was never truly closed. Instead, the Tokugawa shogunate executed a brilliant policy of highly selective, tightly controlled engagement, turning a few specific keyholes into vital channels for the flow of goods, information, and ideas. The policy of Sakoku was not born out of a fear of the outside world, but from a calculated desire for stability and control. The preceding century, known as the Sengoku or Warring States period, had been a time of brutal civil war. The Tokugawa shoguns, after unifying the country, were determined to prevent any external forces from disrupting the fragile peace they had established. They had witnessed how European powers, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese, often used trade and Christian missionaries as a prelude to colonization in other parts of Asia. The shogunate's primary goal was to eliminate these perceived threats. They brutally suppressed Christianity after the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 and expelled Portuguese merchants. But crucially, they did not sever all ties. They meticulously maintained relationships with trading partners they considered less threatening to their political order. The result was not a wall, but a highly regulated filter. The most famous of these controlled openings was the artificial island of Dejima in the Bay of Nagasaki. This fan-shaped trading post, connected to the mainland by a single, well-guarded bridge, became Japan's sole official window to Europe for over 200 years. But it wasn't open to all Europeans. The Dutch, who were primarily interested in commerce rather than religious conversion, were the only Europeans permitted to trade. Their presence was severely restricted. The Dutch East India Company factors were confined to Dejima and were required to make regular, humiliating journeys to the shogun's court in Edo to pay their respects, a ritual designed to reinforce Japanese superiority. Yet, through this tiny aperture, a steady stream of Western knowledge, known as Rangaku or Dutch learning, flowed into Japan. Japanese scholars, often at great personal risk, would secretly visit Dejima to acquire European books on medicine, astronomy, cartography, and military technology. They studied and translated these works, ensuring that Japan's intellectual elite remained surprisingly well informed about scientific developments in the West, all while the official policy was one of supposed isolation. But the idea that Japan only interacted with the Dutch is another oversimplification. Nagasaki was also a bustling hub for trade with China and Korea. Chinese merchant junks arrived regularly, bringing silk, medicines, and books of Confucian philosophy, which were highly influential in shaping Edo period thought and governance. The Japanese also maintained diplomatic and trade relations with the Kingdom of Ryukyu, which was a conduit for goods and culture from Southeast Asia. To the north, the Matsumi clan on the island of Hokkaido conducted extensive trade with the Ainu people and through them had indirect contact with the Russian Empire. The Tsushima domain, situated between Korea and Japan, managed a crucial trading outpost at Wigwon, facilitating a continuous diplomatic and commercial relationship with the Joseon dynasty in Korea. This was not a country that had turned its back on the world. It was a country that had carefully organized its international relationships into a series of managed, monopolistic channels, each designed to serve the state's interests while minimizing risk. This selective engagement had a profound and often overlooked consequence. It allowed for a remarkable flourishing of indigenous Japanese culture. By limiting foreign influence, the Tokugawa shogunate unintentionally created the conditions for a cultural explosion from within. Without the constant influx of new external trends, Japanese art forms had the space to deepen and refine themselves. This was the era that gave us the serene aesthetics of the tea ceremony, the dramatic thrill of kabuki theater, the beautiful woodblock prints of ukiyo-e, and the development of the haiku poetic form. The very things we now consider quintessentially Japanese were, in many ways, products of this period of controlled interaction. The policy allowed Japan to absorb what it needed from the outside world, primarily practical knowledge and luxury goods, while digesting these influences on its own terms, leading to a unique and vibrant cultural synthesis. The myth of total isolation obscures this dynamic process, portraying Japan as passive when it was, in fact, actively curating its own destiny. The reality of Sakoku is not a story of a country hiding from the world, but of a government strategically managing globalization centuries before the term was ever invented, a calculated policy that shaped modern Japan in ways we are only beginning to fully appreciate. And so we arrive at one of history's most famous battles, a name that has become synonymous with final, decisive defeat, Waterloo. The popular image is clear and compelling. The stoic, unflappable Duke of Wellington, standing with his steadfast British and Allied troops on a ridge in Belgium, weathering the furious storms of Napoleon's attacks throughout a long and bloody day. It's a story of British grit and the general's brilliance, a tale that has been celebrated in British history books, paintings, and folklore for over 2 centuries. Waterloo cemented Wellington's place as a national hero and seemed to affirm a certain idea of British military superiority. But this classic narrative, while not entirely false, is dangerously incomplete. It conveniently sidelines the army without which Wellington's stand would have been a glorious but ultimately tragic last stand. For the real story of Waterloo is not a British victory. It is the story of an Allied triumph, and it hinges entirely on the battered, mud-spattered, and desperately timely arrival of Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher and his Prussian army. To understand why the Prussian intervention was so critical, we need to look at the strategic picture in the days leading up to the battle. Napoleon had returned from exile in 1815, plunging Europe back into war. His strategy was characteristically bold: to defeat the 2 armies closest to him, Wellington's Anglo-Allied force and Blücher's Prussians, before they could combine their strength. Just 2 days before Waterloo, Napoleon had engaged the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny. It was a hard-fought contest that ended with the Prussian army being forced to retreat. This was the moment the entire campaign hinged upon. A defeated army retreating could easily scatter, fall into disarray, and be effectively removed from the campaign for weeks. Napoleon assumed exactly this. He sent a third of his force under Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and keep them separated from Wellington, while he turned his main force against the British commander. Napoleon's entire plan relied on the Prussians being out of the picture. What happened next is where the standard narrative often fails. The Prussian retreat from Ligny was not a chaotic rout. Despite being 72 years old and having been trampled by his own cavalry during the battle, the indomitable Blücher maintained control. Crucially, his brilliant chief of staff, August von Gneisenau, initially distrustful of Wellington, nevertheless recognized the strategic necessity of keeping the armies linked. Instead of retreating eastward towards their supply lines, a logical move for a battered army, the Prussians performed a remarkable feat of discipline and navigation. They retreated north parallel to Wellington's own withdrawal towards the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, the place we now know as Waterloo. This was a deliberate move to remain within supporting distance. Throughout the 17th of June, as the torrential rain turned the roads to mud, the Prussian columns marched not away from the fight, but toward it, reorganizing themselves on the move. Gneisenau sent repeated messages to Wellington assuring him they would come, but the British commander had to take this on faith as he prepared his defensive line. The battle on the 18th of June unfolded exactly as Napoleon had hoped, but only for a time. Wellington's masterful defensive positioning was tested to its absolute limit. For hours, his infantry squares endured devastating cavalry charges. His lines absorbed the fire of a grand battery of French cannon, and key strongpoints like the farmhouse of Hougoumont and La Haye Saint saw ferocious, close-quarters combat that swung back and forth. Wellington himself was everywhere, a calming presence in his famous civilian clothes. But by late afternoon, the situation was becoming desperate. The central farm of La Haye Saint had fallen, allowing French artillery to rake the Allied center. The British and Allied lines were thinning, casualties were mounting, and the army was nearing its breaking point. Wellington later stated that the outcome of the battle hung in the balance and that the arrival of the Prussians gave the turn to the scale. He was watching the horizon and his famous, anxious query, "I wish it were night or the Prussians would come," speaks volumes about his reliance on his ally. And then they came, not as a single dramatic wave, but as a growing pressure on the French right flank. The 1st Prussian Corps under General von Bülow began to engage around 4:30 in the afternoon, forcing Napoleon to divert valuable troops away from his main assault on Wellington's Ridge. This intervention was like a man slowly leaning his weight against a door that is about to burst open. It relieved the immediate pressure on Wellington's weary men. As the evening wore on, more and Prussian corps arrived, pouring into the battle and turning Napoleon's flank. The final phase of the battle, the legendary advance of the British Guards, was only possible because the French were now caught in a vice. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's finest, were repulsed not just by British musketry, but by the collapsing morale of an army that now realized it was being attacked from the side and rear. The French line disintegrated into a rout, and the cry of "La Garde recule" signaled the end. The victory was sealed by the relentless Prussian pursuit through the night, which ensured Napoleon's army could not rally. The subsequent downplaying of the Prussian role was largely a product of post-war politics and national pride. In Britain, Waterloo became a powerful symbol of national identity. To share the glory, especially with a German power, diminished the luster of the achievement. Wellington, to his credit, always acknowledged the debt, famously stating that the battle was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, and that the Prussians had arrived decisively. But in the popular imagination, the complex story of Allied cooperation was simplified into a more patriotic tale of British pluck. The reality, however, is strategically unambiguous. Without the Prussians holding firm after Ligny and making their grueling march to the sound of the guns, Wellington would almost certainly have been defeated. Waterloo stands not as a monument to one nation's military genius, but to the power of a coalition, a lesson in trust, coordination, and the simple, unglamorous courage of an army that refused to stay defeated. It reminds us that history's most celebrated solo performances are often, in truth, intricate duets. Leaving behind the calculated statecraft of Edo, Japan, we venture further back in time to the sun-drenched island of Crete, home to one of Europe's first great civilizations, the Minoans. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists and historians painted a captivating picture of this Bronze Age society. They were seen as a uniquely peaceful, almost utopian people, a stark contrast to the warlike kingdoms of the Near East and later mainland Greece. The image was of a thalassocracy, a maritime trading empire governed by priest queens in elegant, open-air palaces, where art celebrated nature, acrobatics, and graceful living. The most compelling evidence for this peaceful vision was the apparent absence of any defensive walls around their magnificent palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia. Unlike the heavily fortified citadels of Mycenae or Troy, the Minoan centers seemed to welcome the world, their sprawling layouts suggesting a society confident in its security and focused on commerce and ritual. This interpretation was deeply appealing, presenting an alternative model of ancient power, one rooted in economic and cultural influence rather than military might. But as is so often the case in archaeology, a more thorough examination of the evidence has chipped away at this idyllic facade, revealing a civilization that was far more complex, and arguably far more familiar in its human struggles for power and survival. The roots of the peaceful Minoan theory can be traced directly to the man who first uncovered their civilization, the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. Excavating the Palace of Knossos in the early 1900s, Evans was profoundly influenced by the art he discovered. The famous frescoes depicted dolphins leaping, lithe bull leapers in motion, and processions of figures bearing offerings, not scenes of conquest or battle. He interpreted the prominence of female figures in these artworks, often shown with serpents or in commanding postures, as evidence of a matriarchal society led by a great goddess, a society that would naturally be more nurturing and less aggressive. Evans, living in the shadow of the Industrial Age and the First World War, was perhaps drawn to the idea of a refined, Prelapsarian paradise in Europe's past. His powerful imagination and his extensive, some would say heavy-handed reconstructions at Knossos, using concrete to recreate columns and frescoes, helped cement this romantic vision in the public mind for generations. It was a story that resonated because it offered a beautiful alternative to the standard narrative of ancient history as a chronicle of war. Later excavations across Crete, however, began to uncover a different story. While the great palaces themselves may not have been encircled by massive walls like those at Mycenae, that does not mean they were undefended. The palaces were often situated in naturally defensible positions on hills or plateaus with steep slopes. Furthermore, archaeologists have found evidence of robust, fortified guard posts along key road networks and at strategic points controlling access to the fertile plains around the palaces. At the site of Gurnia, a Minoan town, a stone fortification wall has been identified. These are not the signs of a society that felt no need for security. They point to a more nuanced system of control, where defense was projected outward to the frontiers of their territory, keeping the central administrative and religious hubs safe and open. The idea of a completely unfortified Crete is simply not supported by the full geographical picture. Even more challenging to the peaceful narrative is the archaeological record of Minoan weaponry. The Minoans were not unarmed aesthetes. Graves across the island have yielded an impressive array of deadly weapons, including long rapiers made of bronze that required great skill to wield, daggers with intricate gold inlaid hilts depicting scenes of hunting and combat, and a variety of spearheads and arrowheads. These were not merely ceremonial objects. Analysis of the swords shows where patterns consistent with practical use. While warfare in the Bronze Age Aegean may not have involved massive set-piece battles, it likely consisted of raids, skirmishes, and conflicts over resources and trade routes, the kind of conflicts that these weapons would have been perfectly suited for. The presence of such an advanced and widespread arsenal indicates that the Minoan elites were warriors as well as traders and priests, capable of projecting force when necessary. The most controversial evidence, however, and the most difficult to reconcile with a purely peaceful image, comes from a few unsettling sites that suggest the possibility of ritual violence. At the temple complex of Anemospilia, archaeologists uncovered a truly grisly scene sealed by an earthquake. In one room, they found the bodies of 3 individuals, a man in his late 30s, a woman in her 20s, and an 18-year-old male. The young man was lying on a central platform, and a magnificent bronze blade lay on top of his chest. The positioning and the context have led some scholars to argue that this is evidence of a human sacrifice interrupted by the earthquake, with the older man perhaps being the priest who was about to perform the act. While this interpretation is still debated, it is not an isolated case. At the Palace of Knossos itself, in an area Evans called the North House, the bones of 4 children were found with cut marks that some experts believe are consistent with sacrificial defleshing, possibly in a time of extreme crisis. Then there are the so-called warrior graves at the cemetery of Phaoni at Archanes, where individuals were buried with their full panoply of weapons, signaling that martial prowess was a key component of their identity and status in the afterlife. This accumulating evidence does not mean we should swing to the opposite extreme and recast the Minoans as bloodthirsty warmongers. The brilliance of their art, the sophistication of their trade networks, and the complexity of their administrative systems are all real achievements. The point is that the peaceful Minoan paradigm was a modern projection, an oversimplification that prevented us from seeing the civilization in its full, fascinating complexity. They were likely a society much like any other powerful Bronze Age state, a mixture of commercial acumen, religious fervor, artistic genius, and when the situation demanded it, military capability. Their power was probably built on a combination of economic dominance, cultural prestige, and the credible threat of force. The Minoans may not have celebrated war in their art to the same degree as the later Mycenaeans, but they were clearly not strangers to its realities. This reassessment enriches our understanding, replacing a simplistic fairy tale with a more human story of a people navigating the same challenges of power, faith, and survival that have faced every complex society throughout history. Their true legacy is not their imagined peacefulness, but their remarkable ability to create a vibrant and influential culture that would shape the Greek world for centuries to come. But the assessment of a society's character is not the only thing that can be warped by time and bias. Sometimes it is the reputation of a single individual that is systematically dismantled by their enemies. Few names in history evoke such instant recognition of madness and cruelty as that of the Roman Emperor Caligula. His brief 4-year reign from 37 to 41 of the Common Era has become a grotesque caricature of imperial power run amok, a catalogue of depravity that includes incest with his sisters, building a 2-mile-long floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae just to ride a horse across it, and the infamous story of planning to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, providing the steed with a marble stable and ivory manger. This image of a capricious, sadistic lunatic has been cemented for 2,000 years. Yet, when we scrutinize the sources of these incredible stories, a far more politically charged and complex picture emerges, one where the line between maniacal tyrant and a young emperor engaged in a brutal power struggle with a hostile aristocracy becomes dangerously blurred. The fundamental problem facing any historian of Caligula's reign is the nature of our evidence. The most detailed accounts we have were written decades after his death by authors who were members of, or sympathetic to, the senatorial aristocracy, the very class that was the primary target of Caligula's policies and his mockery. The works of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, while invaluable, are filled with salacious anecdotes that read like political propaganda. These writers had a clear agenda: to justify Caligula's assassination and to legitimize the subsequent rule of the emperors from the Claudian dynasty, who needed to portray their predecessor as a monster to make their own accession seem like a divine rescue of the state. The stories of Caligula's insanity served a vital political purpose, and their repetition over centuries has turned allegation into accepted fact. It is crucial to remember that during his lifetime, there were no contemporary historians writing a balanced account. The narrative was controlled by the winners. So, what happens when we strip away the most outrageous tales and look at the political and fiscal actions of his reign? A different logic begins to appear. Caligula came to power after the long, dour, and fiscally conservative rule of his great-uncle Tiberius. The Roman treasury was overflowing, but Tiberius had been notoriously stingy, alienating both the army and the people of Rome with his lack of public spending. Caligula, young and popular, immediately embarked on a massive program of public benefaction. He gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard that had proclaimed him emperor. He staged lavish games and gladiatorial shows, and he embarked on ambitious building projects. This was not necessarily the spending of a madman. It was a calculated political strategy to secure his position by buying popularity with the key constituencies of the army and the urban plebs. The problem was the scale. The treasury surplus built up by Tiberius was rapidly depleted, leading to a financial crisis. Caligula's subsequent desperate measures to raise funds, which our sources paint as pure greed, can also be seen as the actions of an emperor whose popular policies had backfired, forcing him to resort to extortionate taxation and the confiscation of senatorial estates to stay solvent. This financial pressure directly fueled his conflict with the Senate, which is the true heart of his reign. Caligula seems to have held the senatorial aristocracy in utter contempt, and he took savage pleasure in humiliating them. The story of the horse Incitatus is a perfect example of this dynamic. While the idea of the horse becoming a consul is almost certainly a satirical exaggeration, there are hints of a deeper insult. It is plausible that Caligula, in a fit of anger at the Senate, threatened to appoint his horse, a creature he adored, to the consulship, stating that the animal would do a better job than the corrupt and scheming senators. This was not clinical insanity. It was a calculated, brutal form of political theater designed to demonstrate that the ancient aristocracy was utterly worthless in his eyes. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot in their formal togas. He humiliated them at his dinner parties, and he openly mocked their traditions. This behavior, while cruel and unstable, had a method to its madness. It was a power play, an effort to break the spirit of the senatorial class and assert the absolute, unchallengeable authority of the emperor. He was testing the limits of his power, and in doing so, he revealed a profound understanding of how to dominate through fear and humiliation. Some of his most infamous actions can also be reinterpreted through the lens of a religious and political power struggle. Caligula's demand to be worshipped as a living god, particularly his order to have a statue of himself installed in the temple in Jerusalem, is often cited as the ultimate proof of his megalomania. Yet the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a divine figure, was a well-established political tool in the eastern provinces of the empire, a way to express loyalty to Rome. Caligula's insistence on his own divinity was an escalation of this practice, but it was not an invention born solely from a diseased mind. It was an assertion of his supreme authority over every corner of the empire, including over a reluctant Jewish population whose refusal to comply highlighted the limits of Roman power. Similarly, his abortive and bizarre military campaign in Gaul, where he supposedly had his soldiers gather seashells as spoils from the ocean, may have a more rational explanation. It could have been a badly botched punishment detail for legions that had mutinied, or a misunderstood symbolic exercise. The shells might have been the helmets of enemy warriors, or a simple misrepresentation by hostile sources eager to paint any action of his as absurd. This is not to argue that Caligula was a stable or benevolent ruler. The weight of evidence suggests he was almost certainly paranoid, cruel, and given to fits of rage. The trauma of his family's destruction under Tiberius, during which his mother and brothers were exiled and killed, must have left deep psychological scars. The severe illness he suffered early in his reign, which some historians speculate could have been encephalitis or another brain-affecting disease, may have fundamentally altered his personality, unleashing a latent instability. The point of reassessment is not to whitewash him, but to understand that his reign was not a simple story of one man's madness. It was a complex and deadly collision between a damaged, arrogant young emperor and a powerful, resentful senatorial aristocracy. His actions, however extreme, were part of a political dialogue, a brutal negotiation of power in the early Roman Empire. The legend of Caligula the monster is a powerful story, but the historical reality is more instructive. It is a case study in how political opposition, when given control of the historical record, can transform a flawed and tyrannical ruler into a mythological beast, obscuring the very real political struggles that defined his disastrous time in power. Crossing the Atlantic from the familiar waters of Europe, we now sail west to a windswept coastline and a discovery that fundamentally rewrote the timeline of world history. Every American schoolchild learns that Christopher Columbus discovered the New World in 1492. It's a foundational date, a turning point that divides historical eras. But what if that momentous first contact wasn't first at all? What if another group of intrepid European sailors had beaten Columbus to the shores of the Americas by nearly 500 years? For centuries, the Norse saga's epic stories of Viking exploration contained tantalizing hints of just such a journey. They told of a skilled navigator named Leif Erikson sailing from Greenland to a land he called Vinland, a place of wild grapes and mild winters. For generations, historians dismissed these tales as legend, beautiful myths with no basis in fact. That is, until a pair of determined Norwegian explorers followed the clues in the ancient texts and stumbled upon the single most important archaeological site in the Americas, Elands Ox Meadows, the undeniable proof that the Vikings had indeed landed here long before any Spanish caravels sailed into view. The clues were always there, preserved in the rich oral tradition of the Icelandic sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. These stories, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries but describing events around the year 1000, are filled with vivid detail. They recount how Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red who had colonized Greenland, heard tales of a land to the west sighted by another sailor who had been blown off course. Intrigued, Leif purchased the man's ship, assembled a crew of 35, and set out to find this new territory. The sagas describe his journey in distinct stages, first to a barren land of flat stones he called Helluland, then to a forested coast he named Markland, and finally to a verdant headland where he built a settlement. He named it Vinland after the grapevines he found growing there. The stories tell of subsequent voyages by other members of Leif's family, including his sister-in-law Gudrid, who gave birth to a son, Snorri, the first known European child born in the Americas. These narratives were specific, but for centuries they were considered just that, narratives. Without physical proof, Vinland remained as mythical as Atlantis. The search for this proof became the life's work of a Norwegian couple, explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad. They reasoned that if the stories were true, the settlement would have to be located somewhere on the North American coast that matched the saga descriptions, a northern location with a climate that could support the wild grapes mentioned, and evidence of a base for repairing ships and exploring further south. They meticulously studied maps and old sailing routes, eventually focusing their search on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland. In 1960, their perseverance paid off. They met a local fisherman named George Decker, who led them to a group of overgrown mounds at a place called Elands Ox Meadows. The moment they saw the site, with its strange, linear ridges overlooking a shallow bay, Helge Ingstad felt a surge of certainty. He turned to his wife and said, "This is not nature, this is culture." The excavations that followed over the next several years confirmed his intuition in the most spectacular way. The team uncovered the remains of 8 sod-walled buildings, identical in construction to Viking-age longhouses found in Iceland and Greenland. These were not the temporary shelters of nomadic hunters. These were substantial, durable structures, including a large hall that could have housed up to 80 people, several smaller dwellings, a forge, and workshops for carpentry and ironworking. It was the evidence of ironworking that was particularly conclusive. The Norse were the only people in the region at that time with the technology to smelt iron. Archaeologists found a forge, an anvil, iron slag, and a simple stone lamp used by a blacksmith. They also uncovered everyday objects that were unmistakably Norse: a bronze ringed pin used to fasten a cloak, a stone spindle whorl for spinning wool, and remnants of butternuts, a type of walnut that grows far to the south, proving the Vikings had traveled beyond their base to gather resources. Dating techniques applied to the wood and other organic material at the site consistently pointed to an occupation around the year 1000, give or take a few decades. This was no random coincidence. It aligned perfectly with the saga accounts of Leif Erikson's voyage. Erland's Ox Meadows was not the bountiful Vinland of the sagas itself. It was more likely a strategic winter camp, a gateway settlement the Norse used as a base for exploring the rich lands further south along the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where grapes and butternuts could indeed be found. The site was used for a relatively short period, perhaps only a decade or so, before being abandoned. The reasons are not entirely clear, but the sagas hint at escalating conflicts with the indigenous peoples the Vikings called Skrælings, likely the Beothuk or Dorset peoples. Faced with hostility and vastly outnumbered, the Norse likely decided the risks of maintaining a permanent settlement so far from their Greenlandic homeland were too great. The discovery of Erland's Ox Meadows was a watershed moment in archaeology. It forced a permanent correction in the history books, proving that the Atlantic had been crossed centuries before Columbus. It validated the Icelandic sagas not as pure fiction, but as historical documents containing a core of genuine geographical memory. This single site transformed our understanding of Viking capabilities, showing they had the seafaring skill and courage to venture into the unknown and establish a foothold on a new continent. While their stay in North America was brief and left no lasting genetic or cultural imprint on the indigenous population, it stands as a monumental achievement. The story of Erland's Ox Meadows is a tribute to the power of taking ancient stories seriously, and a reminder that history's greatest discoveries often happen when someone decides to go looking for the truth behind a legend. And from the legendary voyages of the Vikings, we travel to one of the most dramatic and consequential encounters in world history, a story that has been simplified into a powerful but deeply misleading myth. The narrative is hauntingly familiar. In 1519, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II looked out from his island capital of Tenochtitlan and saw the arrival of the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. According to the tale, Moctezuma and his people believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity who, according to prophecy, was destined to come back from the east in a specific year. Paralyzed by this religious belief, the Aztecs supposedly welcomed the Spaniards with open arms, offering them gifts and submitting to their demands, thereby passively enabling their own downfall. It's a story that paints the Aztecs as superstitious primitives, their sophisticated civilization undone by a simple case of mistaken identity. But when we examine the actual historical sources, a far more realistic and politically astute picture of Moctezuma emerges, revealing an emperor not blinded by faith, but strategically grappling with an unprecedented and dangerous geopolitical crisis. The first and most critical point to understand is that the story of Cortés being mistaken for Quetzalcoatl is almost certainly a later fabrication, one that does not appear in any contemporary Aztec accounts. The most important sources we have are Spanish ones, particularly the letters Cortés wrote to King Charles V and the biography written by Cortés's chaplain, Francisco López de Gamarra. It is in these Spanish narratives that the god identification story is most prominently featured. Why would they promote this idea? The motive is clear. It served as a brilliant piece of propaganda. By framing the conquest as a divine mandate, where the natives willingly accepted the Spanish as gods, Cortés could justify his aggressive actions to the Spanish crown. It transformed a brutal invasion into a seemingly peaceful succession, a narrative that downplayed Spanish violence and framed the collapse of the Aztec Empire as an almost voluntary act, a self-fulfilling prophecy. This version of events conveniently absolved the conquistadors of moral responsibility and legitimized their claims to the land. If we set aside this Spanish propaganda and look at Moctezuma's actions through the lens of realpolitik, his behavior starts to make perfect sense as the cautious diplomacy of a seasoned ruler. Moctezuma was the absolute leader of a complex militaristic empire, but it was an empire built on a fragile foundation of subjugated and resentful city-states. The Aztecs ruled through a combination of military might, political alliances, and the constant threat of force. When reports first reached Moctezuma about strange bearded men arriving on the coast in floating mountains with powerful weapons, his primary concern would not have been theology, it would have been intelligence and threat assessment. Who were these outsiders? How many were there? What were their intentions? And most importantly, how could their arrival destabilize the delicate balance of power within his realm? Moctezuma's initial response was not one of worship, but of classic statecraft. He sent a series of emissaries to meet Cortés. These were not priests, but skilled diplomats and spies. They brought with them extravagant gifts of gold, feathered headdresses, and other luxury items. On the surface, this looks like veneration, but in the context of Mesoamerican political culture, it was a sophisticated diplomatic probe. The gifts served multiple purposes. They were a display of the empire's immense wealth and power, a warning to the newcomers of the formidable force they were dealing with. They were also a test. How would the strangers react to this wealth? Would they be satisfied and leave, or would their greed be inflamed? The reports that came back to Moctezuma were alarming. The Spaniards were not appeased by the gifts. They were utterly captivated by the gold, asking incessantly for more. Furthermore, the emissaries reported on the Spaniards' terrifying weapons, their guns, steel swords, and armored war horses, creatures completely unknown in the Americas. This was not a god returning, it was a powerful, well-armed, and avaricious foreign force. As Cortés advanced inland, expertly exploiting the hatred that subject peoples like the Tlaxcalans held for their Aztec overlords, Moctezuma's strategic dilemma intensified. By the time Cortés reached the gates of Tenochtitlan, he was no longer leading a small band of adventurers. He was at the head of a formidable army of thousands of indigenous allies who saw the Spanish as their ticket to liberation. Inviting Cortés into the city was likely a calculated risk, not an act of submission. Bringing the Spanish inside the capital allowed Moctezuma to keep a close watch on them, to monitor their numbers and their behavior directly. He housed them in a luxurious palace, treating them as honored guests, which in the Aztec world was also a way of controlling and containing them. From this position, he could attempt to negotiate, to learn their weaknesses, and to buy time to formulate a response. This was a strategy of containment and observation, a desperate attempt by a cornered leader to manage a crisis that was spinning out of his control. The idea that he believed Cortés was a god is completely at odds with the sophisticated and often ruthless political maneuvering that characterized his entire reign. Moctezuma was trying to understand a threat, not worship it, and his tragic error was not one of faith, but an underestimation of the sheer audacity and ruthlessness of his opponents, who would soon take him hostage in his own palace, using him as a puppet to try and rule through him. The real story of the Aztec surrender is not a tale of primitive superstition, but a complex tragedy of political miscalculation, imperial overstretch, and the devastating power of a new enemy who understood nothing of the rules of the game he was so decisively breaking. When we imagine the horrors of the European witch hunts, our minds often conjure images of a superstitious and backward Middle Ages, a time of ignorance and fear where accusations of witchcraft were a common and deadly part of life. This mental picture fits all too neatly with the popular caricature of the Dark Ages, a bleak period supposedly dominated by the Church's iron grip on a terrified populace. It's a compelling, if horrifying, story, but it is also a profound chronological error. The Great Witch Craze, the period of mass trials and executions that has become a symbol of religious persecution, was not a product of the medieval era at all. Its deadliest peak occurred centuries later during the early modern period, a time we more commonly associate with the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Age of Exploration. The flames that consumed tens of thousands of victims were fanned not by the simple superstitions of the peasantry, but by a volatile and terrifying mixture of new religious hatreds, emerging nation-states, and revolutionary changes in the law itself. To understand the timing, we need to look at the numbers. While isolated accusations of witchcraft certainly occurred throughout the Middle Ages, they were relatively rare and often dealt with locally. The Church's official stance for much of this period was actually one of skepticism. The influential canon Episcopi, a text dating back to around the year 900, declared that belief in witches flying at night was an illusion and a pagan superstition. Persecution was not a coordinated effort. The dramatic shift began in the 15th century and escalated into a continent-wide panic between the years 1550 and 1650. This is the period that saw the infamous hunts in regions like the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, and Scotland, and later the Salem witch trials in the American colonies in the 1690s. Historians estimate that between 80 and 100,000 people were tried for witchcraft in this era, and roughly half of them were executed. This scale of judicial murder was unprecedented and would have been unimaginable during the height of the Middle Ages. So what changed? The single most powerful accelerant was the religious fragmentation caused by the Protestant Reformation. Beginning in 1517, Martin Luther's challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church shattered the religious unity of Western Europe. This was not just a theological debate, it was a political and social earthquake. For the next century and a half, Catholic and Protestant communities saw each other not merely as competitors, but as soldiers in an apocalyptic battle between the forces of God and Satan. In this heightened atmosphere, the figure of the witch was transformed. No longer just a local malefactor who might curse a neighbor's cow, the witch was reimagined as a soldier in Satan's own army, a part of a vast, organized conspiracy to undermine Christendom from within. Both Protestant and Catholic authorities used accusations of witchcraft as a weapon against their rivals, portraying the other faith as inherently demonic. The fear of the devil became a central part of popular preaching, creating a culture of intense suspicion where any deviation from orthodoxy could be interpreted as evidence of a pact with evil. This religious tension was amplified by a new legal framework that made mass persecution possible. The medieval legal system often relied on ordeals or required accusers to provide evidence and risk punishment themselves if their case failed. But in the early modern period, continental Europe widely adopted the principles of Roman law, which included the use of inquisitorial procedure. In this system, a magistrate could initiate an investigation based on rumor alone. The goal was not to mediate between two parties, but for the state to find the truth, and it granted authorities sweeping powers to arrest, interrogate, and torture suspects. It was this legal machinery that turned individual accusations into chain reaction hunts. The most notorious guide for this process was the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486 by a German Dominican friar. While not an official church document, this misogynistic manual became a bestseller, providing a detailed, step-by-step guide for investigators on how to identify, prosecute, and extract confessions from witches. It placed a particular focus on women, arguing they were more susceptible to demonic temptation, which helps explain why roughly 75% of the victims were female. Under torture, an accused person would inevitably confess to the wildest of accusations: attending a witch's sabbath, having sex with the devil, flying on a broomstick, and then be forced to name accomplices, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of denunciation and death. Furthermore, this period was one of immense social and political instability. The 16th and 17th centuries were marred by the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that devastated Central Europe and killed a huge portion of the population through violence, famine, and disease. In an era with no scientific understanding of epidemics or crop failures, these catastrophes demanded a supernatural explanation. witches became the perfect scapegoats for communal trauma. A village struck by plague or a family whose child had died suddenly needed someone to blame, and the marginalized figure on the outskirts of the community, the poor, elderly woman who had argued with a neighbor, the healer who had fallen out of favor, became a lightning rod for fear and grief. Local grudges and personal vendettas could now be elevated to the status of cosmic battles, with the full power of the state and church backing the accuser. The witch hunts were not a top-down phenomenon imposed on an unwilling populace. They were often fueled by grassroots fears and accusations, which were then amplified and given lethal force by the new legal and religious authorities. The great tragedy of the witch craze is that it was a perfect storm, a convergence of high theology, revolutionary law, and profound human fear that erupted not in the so-called Dark Ages, but in the very dawn of the modern world, a stark reminder that progress in art and science does not always equate to progress in humanity or justice. Consider one of the most stubborn and widely believed facts in the world, a statement you have probably heard your entire life. The Great Wall of China is the only human-made object visible from space with the naked eye. It's a point of national pride, a staple of trivia nights, and a testament to the wall's sheer scale. There's just one problem: it isn't true. This cherished piece of common knowledge is a classic example of a modern legend, a myth that gained traction not in ancient times but in the age of space exploration, and its persistence reveals a fascinating story about how we perceive human achievement and the vastness of our own planet. The origins of this myth are surprisingly murky, but they seem to stem from a game of historical telephone that began long before any human had ever left the atmosphere. One potential source dates back to the 18th century, when an English antiquarian named William Stukeley speculated that the wall might be visible from the moon. This was a purely theoretical, almost whimsical notion, but the idea captured the public imagination. It was repeated and amplified over the centuries, finding its way into popular magazines and books. The myth received its biggest boost in 1938, when it appeared in the second series of Robert Ripley's enormously popular Believe It or Not cartoons, which declared the Great Wall to be the mightiest work of man, the only one that would be visible to the human eye from the moon. This claim, presented as a bizarre fact, cemented the idea in the minds of millions. When the space race began, the myth was already waiting, a ready-made symbol of human grandeur that seemed perfectly suited to the new frontier. The reality, as explained by astronauts who have actually been there, is dramatically different. From low Earth orbit, the altitude where the International Space Station orbits at around 250 miles up, the Great Wall is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to see with the naked eye. The main reason is simple physics and perception. The wall is only about 30 feet wide on average. While it is thousands of miles long, its width is comparable to a highway or an airport runway. From space, the primary way humans detect objects is not by their length, but by their contrast against the surrounding terrain. The Great Wall is made of stone and earth that blend in almost perfectly with the soil and rocks of the northern Chinese landscape. Its color provides very little contrast, making it fade into the background like a single gray thread on a vast tapestry of similar hues. As Chinese astronaut Yong Luwei confirmed after his historic flight in 2003, he could not see the Great Wall from orbit without optical aid. What can be seen easily from space are objects that create a stark visual contrast. Vast urban areas at night are the most obvious, with their brilliant networks of electric lights sprawling across the darkness. During the day, large-scale agricultural projects with distinct geometric patterns, like the circular fields created by center pivot irrigation in the American Midwest, are clearly visible. Major dams, reservoirs, and airports also stand out. Even large highway systems can be more apparent than the Great Wall because they often have different colored surfaces and are lined with vegetation or developments that create a visible line. If you were to stand on the International Space Station and look toward China, you would be far more likely to pick out the bright lights of Beijing or Shanghai long before you could ever hope to discern the subtle, winding line of the Great Wall snaking through the mountains. The ultimate debunking of the myth came when we considered the view from the moon. From that distance, nearly 240,000 miles away, the entire Earth shrinks to a small, beautiful blue and white marble. At that scale, seeing any human-made structure would be utterly impossible. It would be akin to trying to see a single human hair from a distance of over 2 miles away. The idea that a structure just 30 feet wide could be resolved by the human eye from the lunar surface is a physical impossibility. Astronauts from the Apollo missions have consistently stated that no individual human constructions are visible from the moon. The only visible feature is the collective glow of cities at night. The Great Wall myth is a powerful lesson in the difference between poetic imagination and scientific fact. We wanted the wall to be visible from space because it represents a monumental human effort, a symbol of perseverance that seems to deserve such cosmic recognition. But the truth is, our achievements are rooted here on Earth. The real wonder of the Great Wall is not that it can be seen from the heavens, but that it stands as a breathtaking testament to human ambition when seen from the very mountains it was built upon. The next major misconception on our list deals with one of the most fundamental turning points in human history, the moment we supposedly stopped wandering and started planting. The traditional story is often framed as the agricultural revolution, a phrase that conjures images of a sudden, brilliant discovery. We picture a Neolithic genius perhaps watching seeds sprout from discarded food scraps, having a eureka, a moment that changed the world overnight. This narrative suggests that humanity quickly swapped their spears for plows, transitioning from a precarious life of hunting and gathering to the stable, settled existence of farming in a relative blink of an eye. This idea of a rapid revolution is compelling because it offers a clean break between a primitive past and a civilized future. However, a mountain of archaeological evidence now tells a very different story, one of hesitation, experimentation, and a transition so slow that the people living through it would never have known they were in a revolution at all. The reality is that the shift to agriculture was not a single event but a fragmented, global process that unfolded independently in at least 7 different parts of the world over thousands of years. In each of these hearths, the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, the highlands of New Guinea, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and Eastern North America, people began to domesticate local plants and animals, but they did so on a timeline that makes the word revolution seem entirely misplaced. The process was not a switch that was flipped, but a dial that was turned almost imperceptibly slowly. For generations, and indeed for millennia, societies practiced a mixed economy. They were not simply hunters one day and farmers the next. They would hunt game, gather wild plants, and also tend to a small plot of deliberately sown seeds all at the same time. This gradual approach was a sensible strategy of risk management. Why abandon a reliable, millennia-old way of life for an unproven and labor-intensive new one? The evidence for this drawn-out transition comes from painstaking archaeological work. By analyzing ancient plant remains, such as seeds and phytoliths, scientists can track the subtle changes that mark domestication. For example, the seeds of wild grasses have a brittle rachis, the stem that connects the seed to the plant. This brittleness is an evolutionary advantage for the plant, as it allows the seeds to scatter easily. But for a human trying to harvest them, it's a problem. Over generations of human selection, where people would naturally gather the seeds that stayed on the plant longer, a mutation for a tougher rachis became dominant. This change from brittle to tough is visible under a microscope, and it didn't happen in a single season. The same is true for the size of seeds or the reduction of natural defenses like thick husks or bitter taste. These transformations are the result of unconscious selection over hundreds of human generations. The people doing the selecting weren't trying to invent agriculture. They were simply choosing the plants that were easiest to harvest and eat, a process so gradual it was invisible within a single lifetime. Why would communities make this shift at all, especially since early farming was often harder, less healthy, and more precarious than hunting and gathering? The old theory was that a single climatic change or population pressure forced it upon them. The current understanding is far more nuanced. In some regions, a period of climate stability after the last ice age may have created richer environments where people could settle down for longer periods, allowing them to develop deeper knowledge of local plants. In other cases, it might have been a response to pressure, but not necessarily population pressure. It could have been social pressure, like the desire to produce surplus food for feasting and competitive gift-giving to gain status within a community. The key point is that the adoption of farming was not a unanimous decision. It was likely a series of local experiments, some of which succeeded and spread, while others were abandoned when they proved too difficult or when environmental conditions changed. Some groups might have adopted cultivation for a few centuries and then, finding it didn't suit them, returned to a more mobile foraging lifestyle. The path to agriculture was not a straight line but a meandering one, full of dead ends and reversals. This revised understanding fundamentally changes our view of this pivotal era. There was no single invention of agriculture. Instead, there were multiple parallel discoveries across the globe, each with its own unique timeline and set of domesticated species. The people of the Fertile Crescent domesticated wheat and barley, while in China it was rice and millet. In the Americas it was maize, squash and beans, and in New Guinea it was taro and bananas. This independent development suggests that the potential for agriculture was a latent possibility within human societies everywhere, waiting for the right combination of knowledge, need, and environmental circumstance to be realized. The shift wasn't a sudden leap into the future. It was a slow, hesitant dance with nature, a long period of co-evolution where humans and plants gradually changed each other. The so-called revolution was in fact an evolution, a testament to the adaptability and deep environmental knowledge of our ancestors, who patiently shaped the world over thousands of years without ever realizing they were laying the foundation for everything that was to come. The image of the samurai is inseparable from the curved blade of the katana, a symbol of honor, skill, and a warrior's very soul. In countless films and stories, the samurai's identity is forged in the duel, a climactic moment where a single, perfect stroke of the sword decides fate. This romantic vision suggests a code lived and died by the blade. Yet, this focus on the sword is a historical narrowing, a later idealization that obscures the practical reality of the samurai on the actual battlefield. For the vast majority of their thousand-year history, these warriors would have viewed the bow and the spear not as secondary tools, but as their primary instruments of war, with the famous katana serving a far more complex role as a backup weapon, a tool for close-quarters combat, and most importantly, a powerful badge of social and legal status. To understand this, we must step away from the dueling grounds of the Edo period and onto the chaotic battlefields of the earlier eras, like the Genpei War of the 12th century or the Sengoku, the Warring States period, which stretched from the 15th to the 17th centuries. These were not times of individualistic swordplay, but of large-scale, organized warfare. The samurai was first and foremost a mounted warrior, and his defining skill was yabusame, or mounted archery. The ability to control a horse with your knees while accurately firing a powerful asymmetric bow at a moving target was the pinnacle of martial prowess. This was the warfare of the elite, a highly specialized form of combat that required immense training and resources. Battles would often open with volleys of arrows, and a skilled archer could decide the fate of a clash before the armies ever met in close combat. The spear, particularly the long yari, then became the dominant weapon of the infantry formations. In the dense press of a battle, the spear offered a critical advantage in reach, allowing a soldier to strike an opponent before they could get close enough to use a sword. Samurai on foot would wield these spears with devastating efficiency, and the iconic image of the period is not of dueling swordsmen, but of disciplined rows of ashigaru, or foot soldiers, presenting a forest of spear points to an advancing enemy. So where did the sword fit into this lethal toolkit? The katana, along with the shorter wakizashi, was indeed always at the samurai's side, but it functioned as a weapon of last resort or for specific situations. If a soldier's spear shaft was shattered in the fray, or if the fighting devolved into a desperate scrum inside a besieged castle's narrow corridors and cramped rooms, the sword's versatility came to the fore. It was a sidearm, much like a pistol is to a modern soldier whose primary weapon is a rifle. Its importance was undeniable, but it was not the first tool chosen for the main task of winning a battle. The shift in perception began with the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century. After centuries of civil war, the Tokugawa regime imposed a prolonged and rigid peace known as the Edo period. For over 250 years, large-scale battlefield warfare became a memory. The samurai, now a hereditary administrative class of bureaucrats and peacekeepers, no longer needed to practice massed archery or spear drills for war. Their martial arts evolved into pursuits for self-cultivation, discipline, and dueling. It was during this long peace that the sword truly ascended to its legendary status. With no wars to fight, the code of Bushido was codified and romanticized, emphasizing personal honor, loyalty, and the spiritual symbolism of the sword. The katana was no longer just a tool, it was referred to as the soul of the samurai. The art of sword-making reached its aesthetic and technical zenith, with smiths creating blades that were as much works of art as weapons. The famed aijutsu, the quick-draw technique, became a central pillar of martial training, precisely because it was suited for the kind of sudden, personal conflicts that might arise in a peacetime society, a street altercation or a formal duel. This cultural focus, immortalized in popular kabuki plays and later in books and films, permanently cemented the sword as the preeminent symbol of the samurai. The reality, however, is that the bow and spear were the weapons that built and defended the samurai's domains, while the sword was the weapon that came to define their legacy during an era of enforced tranquility. This distinction does not diminish the samurai, it enriches our understanding of them. They were not static figures but adaptable warriors whose tools and ideals evolved dramatically, reflecting the journey of Japan itself from a land of constant civil war to a unified, sophisticated, and peaceful state. For centuries, the Amazon rainforest has been portrayed as the ultimate pristine wilderness, a vast, impenetrable green hell that was fundamentally hostile to large-scale human civilization. The prevailing narrative, championed by early explorers and even some 20th century anthropologists, was that the Amazon's poor, acidic soils could not support intensive agriculture, forcing its inhabitants to live as small, scattered, nomadic tribes. This idea of an unspoiled jungle, empty of significant human history, served to reinforce the notion that the Americas before Columbus were largely vacant lands. But over the past few decades, a quiet revolution in archaeology has been systematically dismantling this myth, and the key to unlocking the Amazon's deepest secrets has been a piece of technology that allows us to see through the forest canopy itself, LiDAR. This laser-based remote sensing technology has revealed a hidden world beneath the leaves, uncovering the traces of a lost urban civilization of a scale and complexity that historians once would have dismissed as impossible. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft towards the ground. These pulses penetrate the small gaps between leaves and branches, bouncing back from the Earth's surface to create a highly detailed, three-dimensional map of the terrain below. By digitally stripping away the vegetation, archaeologists are left with a breathtakingly clear picture of the human-made landscape that has been concealed for centuries. What these LiDAR surveys have revealed across multiple sites in the Amazon is nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of finding isolated villages, the maps show extensive networks of straight, causeway-like roads connecting large settlements. They reveal enormous geometric earthworks, perfect squares, circles, and octagons that were clearly ceremonial centers. Most astonishingly, they show the outlines of urban centers, not in the sense of a dense city like Rome, but as sprawling garden cities with residential mounds, fortified ditches, and centralized plazas arranged in a deliberate sun-ray pattern across the landscape. This was not a wilderness, it was a managed, engineered, and densely populated world. One of the most stunning examples of this new understanding is the discovery in the Bolivian Amazon of a network of settlements belonging to the Khazarab culture, which flourished between 500 and 1400 of the Common Era. LiDAR mapping revealed two remarkably large settlements, now called Kotoka and Landivar, that were previously hidden. These were not simple villages. Each was a major hub covering several square miles and featuring a concentric structure of defensive moats, towering platform mounds that supported civic and religious buildings, and sprawling peripheral settlements connected by straight causeways that ran for miles across the savanna and into the forest. The scale of earth-moving required to create these sites is staggering, involving the movement of millions of cubic feet of soil to create the mounds, canals, and fortifications. This was a society capable of orchestrating massive public works projects, a clear indicator of a complex, hierarchical society with the political organization to command large labor forces. The layout suggests a highly structured society with a clear central authority, something previously thought to be impossible in the Amazonian environment. But how did such a large population sustain itself? The old model insisted that the soil was too poor. The answer lies in a remarkable discovery that predates LiDAR but is now confirmed by it: the existence of terra preta, or dark earth. This is not a natural soil. It is a human-made super soil, incredibly rich in nutrients and capable of remaining fertile for centuries. Ancient Amazonians created it through a deliberate process of adding charcoal from cooking fires, broken pottery, compost, and manure to the naturally poor soil. This charcoal acts like a sponge, retaining nutrients and moisture and creating a self-renewing foundation for agriculture. Far from being helpless victims of a harsh environment, the people of the Amazon actively engineered their landscape to make it more productive. They practiced a sophisticated form of agroforestry, cultivating orchards of valuable trees like Brazil nut and palm, and growing crops in raised fields and terraced slopes. The forest we see today is not a pristine wilderness, but in many ways a cultivated garden, shaped by thousands of years of human management. The lost cities of the Amazon were not isolated fortresses. They were nodes in a vast, managed landscape that produced enough food to support an urban society. This new evidence forces a complete rethink of the Amazon's carrying capacity and the nature of its historical population. Estimates of the pre-Columbian population of the Amazon basin have been radically revised upward, with some scholars suggesting it could have been home to 8 to 10 million people or more before the arrival of Europeans. These societies did not live in spite of the rainforest. They thrived by profoundly understanding it and manipulating it to their advantage. Their disappearance was not due to a failure of their agricultural system or a collapse of their society from within. Instead, they were likely devastated by the same catastrophe that wiped out so many other American civilizations: Old World diseases. When European diseases like smallpox swept through the Americas, they traveled along trade routes far in advance of the explorers themselves. The dense, interconnected populations of the Amazon would have been tragically vulnerable. The society that built the great mound complexes and road networks likely collapsed so quickly and completely that by the time European chroniclers arrived in the region, the survivors had reverted to smaller, more mobile ways of life. The jungle then reclaimed the fields and plazas, leaving only the massive earthworks as silent testimony to a world that was lost. The real story of the Amazon is not one of an empty wilderness, but of a profound human tragedy, where a thriving world of complex cultures was erased by disease, leaving behind a landscape so successfully managed that it masqueraded as pure nature for 500 years. Moving from the grand scale of lost Amazonian cities to a more intimate, yet equally misunderstood artifact of history, we confront an object that has become a universal symbol of medieval cruelty and superstition. Housed in museums and depicted in countless films, the Iron Maiden is the stuff of nightmares, a tall, coffin-like cabinet, often decorated with a sinister female face, its interior bristling with long, sharp iron spikes. The horrifying concept is simple and unforgettable. A victim is sealed inside, and the spikes, strategically placed to avoid vital organs, slowly impale them in a prolonged and agonizing death. It perfectly encapsulates the popular image of the Middle Ages as a time of barbaric justice and unrestrained sadism. But this iconic device has a dark secret of its own, one that has nothing to do with the medieval period. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, the most famous example, is almost certainly not a medieval instrument of torture at all, but a clever and sensationalist forgery from the 18th century, crafted to satisfy a growing public appetite for a dark and Gothic version of history. The evidence against the Iron Maiden's medieval origins begins with a glaring absence in the historical record. For an object supposedly used for such a dramatic and public form of execution, it is strangely missing from all contemporary accounts. Medieval chroniclers were not shy about describing punishments. We have detailed records of executions by burning, hanging, drawing, and quartering, and even the use of devices like the rack and the breaking wheel. Yet, there is not a single reliable first-hand document from the Middle Ages that mentions a spiked cabinet called an Iron Maiden being used anywhere in Europe. Similarly, no archaeological dig has ever uncovered fragments or evidence of such a device dating from that period. This silence is deafening for an object that would have been a major and terrifying public spectacle. The first documented appearance of the Iron Maiden as a physical object occurs not in the 1400s but in the 1700s. The most famous one, which became the model for all others, was allegedly found in Nuremberg, Germany, and was dated by inscription to the 14th century. However, historians now believe it was most likely constructed around the mid-18th century, and the dating was part of the fabrication. So why was this gruesome object created so long after the era it was meant to represent? The answer lies in a profound shift in how people of the Enlightenment and the Romantic periods viewed the past that had preceded them. The 18th and 19th centuries were a time of intense interest in history, but also a time when the medieval period was often caricatured as an age of darkness, superstition, and irrational violence. This was the era of the Gothic novel, with writers like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe crafting thrilling tales set in haunted castles filled with dungeons and torture chambers. The public developed a taste for the macabre and a fascination with what they saw as the thrilling horrors of a bygone age. This created a booming market for artifacts that fit this Gothic aesthetic. Museums, particularly local history museums in German towns like Nuremberg, began to assemble collections of medieval armor and weapons. To make their exhibits more exciting and to attract visitors, there was a powerful incentive to include objects that confirmed these popular, dramatic notions of the past. The Iron Maiden was the perfect centerpiece. It was visually striking, instantly communicated a narrative of medieval brutality, and required no complex explanation. It was, in essence, a theatrical prop designed to evoke a specific emotional response. the fabrication was likely based on a misunderstanding or a deliberate conflation of a real, but much rarer and different form of punishment. There is a single, obscure reference from the ancient world that might have served as inspiration. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era, mentioned that the tyrant Nabis of Sparta used a device he called the apega, a mechanical statue of his wife that would embrace victims with spiked arms. This account is itself debated by historians, but it was known to 18th century scholars. It is plausible that someone, reading this ancient text and looking to create a sensational exhibit, decided to translate this idea into a larger, more dramatic cabinet form and attribute it to the more popularly barbaric Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, therefore, was not a survival from a cruel past, but a new invention cobbled together from classical legend and Gothic imagination. It was history as theme park attraction created centuries after the fact. The legacy of this fabrication is a powerful lesson in how easily our perception of history can be manipulated by objects that feel authentic. The Iron Maiden was so effective as a symbol that it became accepted as fact. It was described in history books, replicated for other museums, and cemented itself in popular culture. It reinforced the very stereotype it was designed to represent, creating a vicious cycle where the fake object was used as proof of the era's alleged barbarism. This case forces us to be critical of the artifacts we take for granted. It reminds us that museums are not always neutral repositories of truth. They are institutions shaped by the cultural trends and commercial pressures of their own time. The real horror of the Iron Maiden is not the fictional death it represents, but its success in torturing the historical record, distorting our view of the Middle Ages for generations by presenting a compelling, terrifying, and utterly fictional narrative as undeniable fact. When we picture ancient Egypt, the image that often comes to mind is one of timeless stability. We see the unchanging gaze of the Sphinx, the eternal pyramids standing against the desert sky, and rows of pharaohs depicted in the same rigid, formal style across millennia. This perception of a civilization frozen in time, a monolithic culture that endured for 3,000 years without significant change, is one of the most persistent myths in popular history. It's an appealing idea, a beacon of order and permanence in the chaotic flow of human events. But to accept this image is to miss the real, far more fascinating story of ancient Egypt, a narrative not of stillness, but of dramatic revolutions, profound theological shifts, and constant adaptation that would make its long history one of the most dynamic in the ancient world. The foundation of this myth of stability lies in the incredible longevity of the Egyptian state itself. The chronology is indeed staggering, from the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3,100 years before the Common Era to the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332, the civilization endured for nearly 3 millennia. This is an almost unimaginable time span. To put it in perspective, the period from the fall of Rome to the present day is only about half as long. Furthermore, the Egyptians themselves were deeply conservative in their art and architecture. They developed a powerful artistic canon, a set of rules for depicting the human form, gods, and pharaohs, that was designed to express order or mat, which was the fundamental principle of the universe. This consistency in artistic style, combined with the enduring use of hieroglyphic writing and the sheer physical presence of monuments that have survived for thousands of years, creates a powerful illusion of a culture that never changed. But this consistency was largely a surface-level ideal, a conservative facade that masked tremendous underlying turbulence. To see beyond this facade, we need only look at one of the most radical and bizarre episodes in all of ancient history, the Amarna period. In the 14th century before the Common Era, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV decided to overturn 1,500 years of religious tradition. He rejected the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods with their animal heads and complex myths, and declared that there was only one true God, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. To cement this theological revolution, he changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, abandoned the traditional capital of Thebes, and built a brand new city dedicated to his sole god at a site we now call Amarna. This was not a subtle shift. It was a top-down cultural revolution as profound as any in history. Akhenaten ordered the names and images of the old gods, especially the powerful state god Ammon, to be chiseled off monuments across Egypt. The artistic style changed overnight from the idealized, muscular forms of previous pharaohs to a strange, elongated, and androgynous depiction of the royal family, with exaggerated features, sloping bellies, and thin arms. This was a deliberate break from tradition, meant to symbolize the unique, otherworldly nature of the king and his connection to the Aten. For a brief time, Egypt was a monotheistic state, a concept that would have been utterly alien to its entire previous history. While his reforms were violently reversed after his death by his successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, the Amarna period stands as irrefutable proof that Egyptian culture was capable of radical, dramatic change initiated from the very top. But the upheavals were not always internal. The 3,000-year timeline was not a single, unbroken line of native Egyptian pharaohs. It was punctuated by several intermediate periods, times of political fragmentation when the central government collapsed and the country split into competing regions. During these eras, which historians call the first, second, and third intermediate periods, the idealized order of Maat was replaced by chaos. There was no single king, and local governors warred with each other. These were not brief moments. The first intermediate period lasted for about a century and a half, a period of low Nile floods, famine, and social unrest that produced literature complaining of a world turned upside down where the poor had become rich and the rich were destitute. Then there were the foreign invasions. For long stretches, Egypt was ruled by outsiders. The Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people from the Levant, conquered the Nile Delta and ruled as the 15th dynasty during the Second Intermediate Period. They introduced new military technology like the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow, which the Egyptians would later adopt to build their own empire. Centuries later, the mighty new kingdom itself fell apart, and Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a time when it was ruled in part by Libyan chieftains and then by the Nubian kings of Kush, who actually saw themselves as the restorers of true Egyptian tradition against corrupt local rulers. The most dramatic evidence of Egypt's dynamic nature comes from its later history during the late period. After the Nubian rule, Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians, then regained its independence, only to be conquered again by the Persian Empire. It was then conquered by Alexander the Great, and after his death, it was ruled for 3 centuries by the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty. This was the Egypt of Cleopatra VII. We often think of Cleopatra as the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, which is true, but we seldom appreciate that she was actually Macedonian Greek, a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. She was the first ruler of her dynasty to even bother learning the Egyptian language. Her capital, Alexandria, was a gleaming metropolis of Greek culture, the home of the Great Library, and a world away from the old religious centers like Thebes and Memphis. Yet she and her predecessors ruled as pharaohs, building temples in the traditional Egyptian style to legitimize their power to the native population. This final chapter of ancient Egypt was a fascinating fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture, a hybrid civilization that was still distinctly Egyptian in many ways, but had absorbed centuries of foreign influence. The idea of an unchanging Egypt simply cannot account for a reality where the last pharaoh was a Greek-speaking queen who battled the Roman Empire. The story of ancient Egypt is not one of static permanence, but a compelling saga of resilience and adaptation. It's the story of a culture that could experience radical internal revolution, shatter into fragments, be ruled by foreign kings, and yet still maintain a core identity so powerful that it compelled its conquerors to present themselves in the guise of the ancient pharaohs. The pyramids may stand still, but the people who built them and the civilization that grew around them were always in motion. For nearly a century and a half, the reign of the dinosaurs was one of paleontology's greatest stories, and their disappearance was its greatest mystery. The prevailing wisdom, deeply influenced by the scientific principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that geological change happens slowly and gradually pointed to a slow decline. Experts proposed that the dinosaurs had faded away over millions of years, victims of a changing world. Perhaps a gradual shift in climate made the planet too cold for the giant reptiles, or maybe the rise of flowering plants altered the ecosystem, or colossal volcanic eruptions in India, known as the Deccan Traps, had slowly poisoned the atmosphere. These were comfortable, gradualist theories that fit the established scientific framework. The idea that a single, cataclysmic event from outer space could wipe out 75% of all life on Earth seemed like the stuff of science fiction, a fantasy unworthy of serious consideration. That is, until a father and son team of scientists, armed with a thin layer of clay and an unconventional idea, forced the entire field to look up at the sky in terror. The revolution began not with a bang, but with a quest for a different kind of knowledge. In the late 1970s, physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, geologist Walter Alvarez, were working in Italy, studying the rate of sedimentary rock formation. They were focused on a specific, thin layer of clay that marked the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, the very point in time when the dinosaurs vanished. Walter Alvarez wanted to know how long it took for this clay layer to be deposited, thinking it might represent tens of thousands of years of slow accumulation. To find out, they devised a clever method. They knew that meteoritic dust, rich in the rare element iridium, constantly rains down on Earth at a very low but steady rate. By measuring the amount of iridium in the clay layer, they could calculate how long that layer took to form. The results were staggering. Instead of a tiny amount spread over millennia, they found an iridium concentration 30 times higher than normal. This was not a slow trickle of space dust. It was an incredible spike, a sudden, global deluge of extraterrestrial material. The only plausible explanation for such a massive, worldwide iridium anomaly was a colossal impact from an asteroid or comet. Luis Alvarez, thinking like a physicist, did the math. He calculated that an object roughly 6 miles wide striking the Earth would eject enough pulverized rock and iridium-rich debris into the atmosphere to create the layer they had found. This was the birth of the Alvarez hypothesis, a radical and terrifying proposal that the dinosaurs were killed off in a single, very bad day. The initial reaction from the paleontological establishment was one of sheer disbelief and often outright hostility. The hypothesis was attacked as a simplistic, lazy answer that ignored the complex, nuanced fossil record. Critics argued that the dinosaur fossil record itself showed a pattern of decline millions of years before the end of the Cretaceous period, suggesting a long, drawn-out extinction. They pointed to the Deccan Traps in India, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, which were erupting around the same time and could have caused significant climate change. To many, it seemed far more reasonable that slow, Earth-bound processes were to blame rather than a fantastical intervention from space. The battle between the gradualists and the catastrophists became one of the most heated scientific debates of the 20th century. For the Alvarez hypothesis to be accepted, it needed more than a layer of iridium-rich clay. It needed a smoking gun. It needed a crater. The search for that crater became a global geological detective story. The impact would have been so immense that it must have left a scar on the planet. Researchers began looking for a crater that was the right age, 66 million years old, and the right size, at least 100 miles in diameter. Several candidates were proposed, but they were either the wrong age or too small. The breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected direction: the oil industry. Geologists working for Pemex, the Mexican state oil company, had been conducting gravity surveys and seismic readings in the Yucatan Peninsula in the 1950s and 60s. They detected a massive, mysterious subterranean arc structure, but their data was kept as a corporate secret. It wasn't until the 1980s that this data was re-examined by a team of scientists, including geophysicist Glenn Penfield. He realized that the gravitational anomalies formed a perfect, gigantic ring, more than 110 miles wide, buried under a kilometer of younger limestone. The structure was centered near the town of Chicxulub, and when samples were taken, the rock showed clear signs of a violent impact, including shocked quartz and glassy tektites. The smoking gun had been found. The discovery of the Chicxulub crater didn't just confirm the impact, it allowed scientists to reconstruct the horror of that day with chilling precision. The asteroid, traveling at cosmic speed, struck the Yucatan Shelf, which was then a shallow sea. The energy released was equivalent to billions of atomic bombs detonating at once. The initial impact vaporized rock and water, creating a fireball so hot it ignited wildfires across the globe. Colossal tsunamis, thousands of feet high, radiated out from the crater, scouring coastlines. But the real killer was what happened next. The impact blasted trillions of tons of sulfur-rich rock and dust high into the atmosphere, creating a global shroud that blocked out the sun for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis ground to a halt, collapsing the base of the food chain. The world plunged into a prolonged impact winter with temperatures crashing. Then, as the sulfur aerosols mixed with water vapor, they fell back to Earth as acid rain, poisoning the oceans and lakes. The non-avian dinosaurs, along with the pterosaurs, the giant marine reptiles, and countless other species, simply could not survive this cascade of global catastrophes. The Alvarez hypothesis, once a fringe idea, had provided a coherent, evidence-backed narrative for one of Earth's most pivotal moments. It taught science a humbling lesson about the power of chance and the role of sudden, violent events in shaping the history of life, proving that sometimes the most dramatic chapters in our planet's story are written not by slow, gradual forces, but by a single, world-shattering collision. And so, as our journey through these 30 historical course corrections comes to a close, we are left with a profound and empowering realization. The story of history is not a dusty scroll stored in a sealed vault. It is a living, breathing conversation, a vibrant and ongoing investigation. Each of these moments, from the reimagined Neanderthal to the lost cities of the Amazon, is not a testament to the failure of historians, but a brilliant beacon illuminating the very process of discovery. Being proven wrong is not a sign of weakness in this discipline. It is the engine of its strength. It is the undeniable proof that our curiosity is alive, that our methods are evolving, and that we possess the humility to admit when the evidence leads us down a new, more fascinating path. The rewriting of history is not an admission of past ignorance, but a celebration of present understanding. This continuous revision reminds us that our knowledge of the past is always a work in progress, a tapestry being woven with new threads as they are discovered. The past itself does not change, but our comprehension of it deepens with every unearthed artifact, every translated scroll, and every scientific breakthrough. What we accept as fact today is simply the best interpretation we have based on the evidence available now. Tomorrow, a farmer's plow might strike a forgotten tomb, a scholar might decipher a long-lost language, or a new technology like genetic sequencing might reveal a hidden lineage, and another chapter will need to be edited. This is the thrilling, dynamic nature of historical study. It is a field built not on unshakable dogma, but on a foundational willingness to be surprised, to be challenged, and to grow. So we leave you with this question to ponder, a mystery that lies just beyond the edge of our current understanding. What historical fact that you learned in school that you've always taken for granted do you think might be the next to fall? Is there a famous figure whose story seems too neat, a long-held belief about an ancient culture that feels ripe for re-examination. The next great historical discovery is out there, waiting for a fresh pair of eyes or a new technology to bring it to light. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We're incredibly curious to hear which mysteries you think are next on the list. And if you've enjoyed this expedition into the ever-changing story of our past, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the shadows and secrets of history. The conversation is far